Whispers beneath the ice. Alaska doesn't just exist. It watches. It remembers. Beneath layers of permafrost and centuries of snow lies a consciousness older than the first human footprint, older than the Ice Age itself. The last frontier isn't just a nickname, it's a warning. This is where civilization ends and something else begins. In the scattered towns that dot this vast wilderness, people live differently. They understand that the darkness between their homes isn't empty. They know that the howling wind carries more than just weather. They've learned to listen carefully to what the land whispers back. Tonight, we journey to Alaska's smallest communities, places where the population can be counted on two hands, where everyone knows everyone, and where secrets have nowhere to hide except in the endless white expanse that surrounds them. These are stories that don't make the evening news. They're shared in hushed tones over coffee, passed down through generations who've learned that some truths are too strange for outsiders to believe. But here, in the heart of the last true wilderness, the impossible becomes routine. The supernatural becomes survival. And the line between what's real and what's lurking just beyond the tree line disappears entirely. These are 10 true encounters from Alaska's forgotten corners, where the cold isn't the only thing that can kill you, and where going missing doesn't always mean you're lost. Sometimes, it means you've been found by something that was waiting all along. The wind is picking up now. The temperature is dropping. And somewhere in the distance, Alaska is calling your name. Story 1, The Vanishing Roadhouse of Nanana. Jake Morrison had been running freight between Fairbanks and Anchorage for 12 years. He knew every mile of the park's highway, every curve, every truck stop, every place where the road got treacherous when the weather turned bad. On that particular February night, the weather was turning very bad indeed. The blizzard had come out of nowhere, the way they do in Alaska. One minute Jake could see the road clearly in his headlights, the next minute the world had turned into a swirling wall of white. Visibility dropped to maybe 10 feet. The radio crackled with warnings about wind gusts reaching 70 miles per hour. Smart drivers were pulling over, waiting it out. Jake should have been one of them. Instead, he pressed on, his 18-wheeler crawling through the storm at 15 miles per hour. He had a deadline to meet, and the load of construction supplies in his trailer represented a paycheck he couldn't afford to lose. Besides, he'd driven through worse. Or so he told himself as the truck shuddered against another gust of wind. That's when he saw the light. It was warm and yellow, cutting through the storm like a beacon. As he got closer, Jake could make out the familiar shape of a roadhouse, one of those combination gas station, diner, and motel operations that served as lifelines for travelers on Alaska's remote highways. The neon sign read, Aurora Roadhouse, in cheerful red letters. Steam rose from the chimney, and through the frosted windows, he could see the welcoming glow of interior lights. Jake pulled his rig into the parking lot, grateful to be out of the wind. Strange thing was, he didn't remember this roadhouse being here before. He'd driven this stretch of highway hundreds of times, and he prided himself on knowing every landmark. But maybe the storm was playing tricks with his memory. Maybe he'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. The warmth hit him like a physical force when he pushed through the front door. The place had that classic roadhouse feel, checkered linoleum floors, red vinyl booths, a long counter with stools, and the smell of coffee and bacon grease that seemed permanently embedded in the walls. A few other travelers sat scattered around the dining area, all of them looking as relieved as Jake felt to be out of the storm. Coffee, hon. The waitress appeared at his elbow almost immediately. She was maybe 40, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of smile that made you feel like family. Her name tag read, Dolores. God, yes, Jake said, sliding into a booth near the window. And whatever you've got that's hot. I wasn't expecting this storm to hit so hard. Dolores poured his coffee from a pot that seemed to never empty. They never do they? Weather up here has a mind of its own. Where you headed? Anchorage. Got a load of supplies for a construction job. Jake wrapped his hands around the mug, savoring the warmth. How long you think this storm's going to last? Oh, these February blizzards can go on for days, Dolores said. But don't you worry. We've got rooms upstairs if you need to wait it out. And the generator's full, so we'll keep the heat and lights running no matter what. Please subscribe if you like my videos. Jake nodded, though something nagged at him. 20 years seemed like a long time to run a roadhouse he'd never noticed before. But the coffee was good, the food was better, and the warmth was exactly what he needed. Maybe he'd just been driving on autopilot all these years, never really paying attention to the smaller stops along the way. He dozed off in the booth sometime after midnight, lulled by the warmth and the distant sound of the storm. When he woke up, gray daylight was filtering through the windows. The wind had died down to a whisper. The snow had stopped. Morning, hon, Dolores said, appearing with fresh coffee as if she'd been waiting for him to wake up. Storms moved on. Roads should be clear now. Jake looked out the window and blinked in surprise. His truck sat in the parking lot exactly where he'd left it, but the snow around it was barely ankle deep. For a storm that had been raging for hours, there should have been at least 2 feet of accumulation. The parking lot looked like it had been plowed recently, though he hadn't heard any snow removal equipment. That's weird, he muttered. Seemed like a lot more snow last night. Oh, these storms always look worse than they are when you're in the middle of them, Dolores said. Your truck's all warmed up and ready to go. Earl went out and started it for you about an hour ago. Jake looked around the diner. The other customers from the night before were gone. In fact, the place was completely empty except for him and Dolores. When did everyone leave? Early risers, all of them. You know how it is, soon as the storm breaks, people want to get back on the road. Something felt off, but Jake couldn't put his finger on what. The food had been real. The warmth had been real. Dolores was standing right there, as solid and normal as anyone. But there was something dreamlike about the whole experience, something that didn't quite add up. He paid his bill, $37 for dinner, coffee, and the warmest welcome he'd had in months, and walked out to his truck. The engine was running, just like Dolores had said. The cab was warm and defrosted. But when Jake looked back at the roadhouse, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were no other tire tracks in the parking lot. Not from the other customers' vehicles. Not from a snow plow. Not even from Earl, who had supposedly started his truck. Just his own 18-wheeler's tracks, leading in from the highway. Jake sat in his idling truck for a long moment, staring at the Aurora Roadhouse. It looked exactly the same as it had the night before, warm lights, steam from the chimney, Dolores visible through the window wiping down tables. But those missing tire tracks bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the park's highway. In his mirrors, he watched the roadhouse recede into the distance until it was just another dot in the vast Alaskan landscape. He made a mental note of the mile marker, 237.5, so he could find it again on future runs. 2 weeks later, Jake was heading north on the same route when he remembered the Aurora Roadhouse. He'd had a good experience there, and Dolores's coffee had been excellent. He started watching for it as he approached mile marker 237.5. It wasn't there. Jake slowed down, thinking maybe he'd remembered the location wrong. He drove another 5 miles, then turned around and drove back 10 miles. There was no roadhouse. No building of any kind. Just endless spruce forest and the kind of pristine snow that hadn't been disturbed by human activity. He stopped at the next truck stop and asked the clerk about the Aurora Roadhouse. The kid, couldn't have been more than 20, shook his head. Never heard of it, and I've lived around here my whole life. There's no roadhouse between here and Nenana. Just wilderness. Jake tried asking other drivers, but got the same response. No one had ever heard of the Aurora Roadhouse. According to everyone he talked to, there was no place to stop along that stretch of highway except for the truck stop where he was sitting. But Jake knew what he'd experienced. He had the receipt to prove it, $37 charged to his credit card on February 15. When he called the credit card company to ask about the merchant, they told him the charge had come from Aurora Roadhouse, Nenana, Alaska. But when he tried to find a phone number or address for the business, nothing came up. That was 3 years ago. Jake still runs the same route, and he still looks for the Aurora Roadhouse every time he passes mile marker 237.5. He's never seen it again, even during the worst storms. But sometimes, when the weather turns really bad and the visibility drops to almost nothing, he swears he can smell coffee and bacon on the wind. And sometimes, late at night when he's fighting to stay awake on that lonely stretch of highway, he thinks about Dolores and her warm smile, and he wonders if maybe the Aurora Roadhouse only appears when travelers really, truly need it. Maybe it's Alaska's way of taking care of people who are foolish enough to venture into her wilderness unprepared. Other truckers have started sharing similar stories. Always during blizzards. Always when they're in real trouble. A roadhouse that appears out of nowhere, offering warmth and safety and food that tastes like home. The details vary, sometimes it's called the Northern Lights Diner, sometimes the Midnight Sun Cafe, but the experience is always the same. A safe harbor in the storm, run by people who seem to know exactly what travelers need. And always, when the storm passes and they return to look for it, there's nothing there but wilderness and the wind through the trees. Jake doesn't talk about it much anymore. People think he's crazy, or that the isolation of long-haul trucking is getting to him. But he knows what he experienced that night, and he knows he wasn't alone. The Aurora Roadhouse exists, somewhere between the storm and the clearing, between desperate need and divine intervention. He just hopes he never needs to find it again. Story 2, The Lights over Shungnak. Sarah Chen had come to Shungnak to teach 4th grade, but she stayed to document something that shouldn't exist. The village of fewer than 300 people sits along the Kobuk River in northwestern Alaska, accessible only by plane or boat. For most of the year, it's cut off from the outside world by ice and snow and the kind of darkness that city dwellers can't imagine. Sarah had arrived in August, full of enthusiasm for her first teaching job and ready to make a difference in the lives of native Alaskan children. She'd grown up in Seattle, and she thought she knew what darkness meant. She was wrong. By October, the sun was setting before 3 p.m. By November, it barely rose at all. The polar night had begun, and Shungnak was plunged into a darkness so complete that stepping outside without a flashlight meant risking your life. Sarah had never experienced anything like it. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it was a presence unto itself, thick and heavy and alive with possibilities. That's when she first saw the lights. It was November 15th, according to her journal. She'd been grading papers late in her small apartment above the school when something bright caught her eye through the window. At first, she thought it might be the aurora borealis. The northern lights were common this far north, and she'd been hoping to see them since her arrival. But these lights were different. They moved in formation, 6 orbs of pale blue light drifting slowly across the valley floor about a mile from the village. They pulsed in unison, growing brighter and dimmer in a rhythm that reminded Sarah of breathing. Or a heartbeat. She watched them for 20 minutes before they disappeared behind a stand of spruce trees. The next night, they were back. Same lights, same formation, same hypnotic pulsing. This time, Sarah was ready with her camera. She managed to get several photos, though the lights appeared much dimmer in the pictures than they had to her naked eye. When she showed the photos to her students the next day, they became very quiet. "Miss Chen," said Tommy, an 8-year-old with serious dark eyes, "my grandmother says not to look at those lights. She says they're not for us." "What do you mean, Tommy?" The boy glanced around at his classmates, as if checking to make sure it was safe to speak. "She says they're the spirits of people who got lost in the dark. They're looking for the way home, but they can't find it. And if you watch them too long, they might think you're lost too." Sarah smiled gently. She respected the traditional beliefs of her students' families, but she was also a woman of science. "That's a beautiful story, Tommy. But I think these might be some kind of natural phenomenon. Maybe related to the aurora, or atmospheric conditions we don't understand yet. That night, she set up her camera on a tripod and pointed it toward the valley. She also had her telescope, a good pair of binoculars, and a notebook where she planned to record her observations. If these lights were some unknown natural phenomenon, she wanted to document them properly. The lights appeared at 9:17 p.m., right on schedule. Through the telescope, Sarah could see that they weren't solid objects at all, but seemed to be made of the same stuff as the aurora, dancing particles of light that shifted and swirled even as they maintained their overall spherical shape. They moved in perfect formation, never varying their spacing, never breaking their synchronized pulsing. Sarah made careful notes about their size, brightness, duration of visibility, and movement patterns. She took dozens of photographs. She even tried recording video, though the lights barely showed up on her phone's camera. For 3 hours, she watched and documented, completely absorbed in what she was seeing. Then one of the lights broke formation. It happened so suddenly that Sarah almost missed it. The light on the far left of the formation suddenly darted forward, moving much faster than the others. It stopped about halfway between the forest and the village, hovering maybe 50 feet above the ground. And then, impossibly, it seemed to turn toward her. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Through her telescope, she could swear the light was looking directly at her window. It pulsed once, twice, 3 times, a different rhythm than before. Almost like it was trying to communicate. Without really thinking about it, Sarah picked up her flashlight and pointed it toward the light. She clicked it on and off 3 times, mimicking the pattern the light had made. The response was immediate. All 6 lights suddenly converged on the one that had broken formation. They formed a tight cluster, pulsing rapidly in a complex pattern that reminded Sarah of Morse code. Then, as suddenly as they'd gathered, they dispersed and disappeared. Sarah sat in her dark apartment for a long time after that, staring out at the empty valley. She'd crossed some kind of line, she realized. She'd gone from observer to participant. And she wasn't sure how she felt about that. The next day, she tried to research similar phenomena online, but the internet connection in Shungnak was sporadic at best. She managed to find a few references to unexplained lights in remote areas of Alaska, but nothing that matched exactly what she was seeing. Most of the reports were dismissed as ball lightning or unusual aurora activity. But Sarah knew what she'd seen. Those lights had responded to her signal. They'd communicated with her. That night, she was ready with a more sophisticated plan. She'd worked out a simple pattern of flashes, 1 flash for yes, 2 for no, 3 for question. If the lights were intelligent, maybe she could establish some kind of communication. They appeared at 9:15 p.m. this time, 2 minutes earlier than the night before. Sarah waited until they were in their usual formation, then aimed her flashlight toward them and flashed once, "Yes, I'm here." The response came immediately. All 6 lights pulsed once in unison. "Yes, we're here too." Sarah's heart was racing. She flashed 3 times, question. "Do you understand me?" 1 flash from the lights. "Yes." 3 flashes from Sarah. "Are you alive?" A long pause. Then 1 flash. "Yes." Over the next hour, Sarah conducted the strangest conversation of her life. The lights seemed to understand her simple code, responding to her questions with an intelligence that defied explanation. They were aware of her. They were aware of the village. They had been coming to this valley for a very long time. When Sarah flashed 3 times and then spelled out WHY in Morse code, the lights went dark for several minutes. When they reappeared, they were in a different formation, a straight line pointing toward the mountains to the north. They pulsed once, as if to say, "Follow," then disappeared entirely. Sarah wrote frantically in her journal that night, trying to capture every detail of the encounter. She was dealing with something unprecedented, something that could change everything scientists thought they knew about consciousness and intelligence and life itself. She had to document it properly. She had to find a way to share this discovery with the world. But when she tried to upload her photos and videos to the cloud the next day, she discovered that none of them had turned out. The camera had been working perfectly, she'd tested it before and after, but every single file from the night before was corrupted. Just random pixels and digital noise. It didn't matter. She still had her notes, her observations, her memories. And she had the promise of more encounters to come. The lights appeared every night for the next 2 weeks, always responding to her signals, always seeming to grow more sophisticated in their communication. Sarah began to feel like she was learning a new language, one based on patterns of light instead of words. She filled 3 notebooks with her observations and theories. Then, on November 30th, something changed. The lights appeared as usual, but this time they were brighter. Much brighter. Through her telescope, Sarah could see that their internal structure was different too, more complex, more detailed. And when she flashed her greeting, their response was immediate and overwhelming. All 6 lights suddenly blazed with the intensity of searchlights, flooding the valley with blue-white radiance. Sarah was temporarily blinded, even through her closed eyelids. When her vision cleared, she saw that the lights had moved much closer to the village. They were hovering directly over the school building now, maybe 100 feet above her apartment. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and stumbled outside. The lights were so bright that they cast sharp shadows on the snow, bright as daylight. She could hear dogs barking throughout the village, and she saw lights coming on in windows as people woke up to investigate the disturbance. She pointed her flashlight up at the hovering orbs and flashed 3 times, question. What do you want? The response came not as pulses of light, but as words formed in her mind. Not heard, but somehow directly implanted in her consciousness, come with us. Sarah staggered backward, nearly falling in the snow. The voice, if it could be called a voice, was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was simply there, inside her head, as clear as her own thoughts. I can't, she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she spoke aloud or just thought the words. You called to us, the voice said. You wanted to understand. Come, and you will understand everything. The lights began to descend slowly toward her. Sarah could feel a strange tingling sensation, as if the air itself was becoming charged with electricity. Her hair stood on end. Her flashlight flickered and went out. That's when she heard Tommy's grandmother calling her name. Miss Chen. Miss Chen, get inside. Don't look at them anymore. Sarah turned to see the elderly woman standing in the doorway of a nearby house, gesturing frantically for her to come inside. They're not for us, the woman called. Come away from them. The urgency in the woman's voice broke whatever spell the lights had cast over Sarah. She ran toward the house, not looking back even when the blue radiance intensified behind her. Tommy's grandmother grabbed her arm and pulled her inside, slamming the door behind them. They've been watching you, the old woman said. My grandson told me you were talking to them. You shouldn't have done that. They're not what you think they are. What are they? Sarah asked. The woman was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the lights, which were slowly rising back into the sky. My grandmother told me stories, she said finally. About the time before the missionaries came, when the shamans could still speak to the spirits of the land. She said there were lights that came in the dark time, spirits that had been human once but had gotten lost between worlds. They remember being alive, but they can't find their way back. So they try to take others with them, to show them the way. That's just folklore, Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. Is it? The old woman asked. You've been talking to them for weeks. Have you felt them getting stronger? Have you felt them pulling at you? Sarah didn't answer, but she knew the woman was right. Each night, the encounter had become more intense. Each night, she'd felt more drawn to the lights, more connected to whatever intelligence guided them. Tonight, she'd almost followed them into the darkness. She spent the rest of the night at Tommy's grandmother's house, listening to stories about the spirits of the land and the dangers of communicating with things that existed between worlds. When dawn finally came, a brief, gray twilight that passed for daylight in December, the old woman walked her back to the school. "Don't watch for them anymore," she warned. "Don't signal to them. They know where you are now, and they'll keep trying to take you. The only way to stay safe is to ignore them completely." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to insist that this was a scientific discovery too important to abandon. But she couldn't forget the voice in her head, the overwhelming compulsion she'd felt to follow the lights into the darkness. Maybe some things weren't meant to be understood by human minds. That night, she closed her curtains and didn't look out the window. She could see the blue glow around the edges of the fabric, and she could feel the lights calling to her, but she forced herself to grade papers and plan lessons and do all the normal things that kept her grounded in the human world. The lights came every night for another week, growing brighter each time. On December 8th, they were so brilliant that the glow leaked around her curtains and filled the entire apartment with blue light. Sarah huddled under her blankets, hands pressed over her ears, trying to block out the voice that whispered constantly in her mind, "Come with us. Come and understand. Come and be free." On December 9th, the lights didn't come. Sarah waited all night, but the valley remained dark. The same thing happened the next night, and the next. By December 15th, she was starting to think they were gone for good. She found her journal that morning, open to a page she didn't remember writing. In her own handwriting, but in a script that seemed somehow different, were the words, "They've learned to mimic daylight. Soon, no one will be able to tell the difference. Soon, everyone will follow." Sarah stared at the page for a long time, trying to remember when she could have written those words. She had no memory of it. The handwriting was definitely hers, but something about it seemed wrong, as if someone else had been guiding her hand. She tore the page out of the journal and burned it in her wood stove. Then she packed her bags and called for a plane to take her back to Anchorage. She told the school board that she had a family emergency, that she couldn't finish out the school year. Sarah never returned to Shungnak. She took a teaching job in Fairbanks, where the nights were dark but not completely black, where there were streetlights and traffic and all the reassuring signs of human civilization. She never spoke publicly about what she'd experienced in the village, though she still has her notebooks hidden in a safe deposit box. But sometimes, on the darkest nights of winter, she stands at her window in Fairbanks and looks north toward the Kobuk River Valley. She thinks about the lights and the voice that called to her from the darkness. She wonders if they're still there, waiting for the next curious soul to signal back. And sometimes, just for a moment, she thinks she sees a faint blue glow on the horizon, pulsing in the rhythm she remembers so well. When that happens, she closes her curtains tight and doesn't look outside again until morning. Because she knows that some invitations, once extended, are never really withdrawn. The lights are still out there, somewhere between the human world and whatever lies beyond. And they're still learning to mimic the things that make us feel safe. They've learned to mimic daylight. And someday, when they've perfected their disguise, no one will be able to tell the difference between the light that guides us home and the light that leads us astray. Story 3, The Town That Slept Too Long, Port Protection. Port Protection sits on the northern tip of Prince of Wales Island, a community so remote that it's accessible only by boat or seaplane. 57 people call it home, living off the grid in a place where everyone knows everyone, where survival depends on cooperation, and where the rhythm of life follows the tides and the seasons rather than clocks and calendars. At least, that's how it used to be. It started on March 15, 2019, with a storm unlike anything the longtime residents had ever seen. The weather in southeast Alaska is notoriously unpredictable, but this storm seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. The wind didn't howl, it whispered, carrying sounds that didn't belong to any earthly weather pattern. The rain fell upward for minutes at a time before gravity seemed to remember its job. And the darkness that came with the storm was absolute, as if someone had thrown a blanket over the entire island. Elena Rodriguez had been the volunteer weather observer for Port Protection for 15 years. She took pride in her meticulous record-keeping, noting barometric pressure, wind speed, temperature, and precipitation every day at precisely 6 a.m., noon, and 6 p.m. She'd weathered hurricanes, ice storms, and fog so thick you couldn't see your own feet. But this storm was different. Her last weather entry, recorded at 6 p.m. on March 15, simply read, barometer failing. Wind from impossible direction. Time seems wrong. The storm lasted 18 hours, trapping the residents in their homes with a darkness so complete that flashlights seemed to barely penetrate it. Emergency radios picked up only static. Cell phones showed no signal. The community was completely cut off from the outside world, alone with whatever was happening around them. When the storm finally passed and the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the clouds, something extraordinary happened. The entire population of Port Protection slept through it. Not just overslept. Not just slept in. They slept for 19 hours and 43 minutes straight, every single one of them, from the oldest resident, 92-year-old Harold Wickham, to 6-month-old baby Sarah Malone. 57 people in a community that had never seen a synchronized event more complex than their annual 4th of July barbecue all fell into the deepest sleep of their lives at exactly the same moment. Elena was the first to wake up, and she knew immediately that something was wrong. Her battery-powered alarm clock read 1:43 a.m., but the light coming through her windows was the pale gray of late afternoon. She stumbled to her weather station, trying to shake off the disorientation that felt like the worst jet lag of her life. According to her instruments, it was 2:15 p.m. on March 17. She had lost an entire day. Elena grabbed her radio and tried to raise the other residents. One by one, they responded, all of them confused and disoriented. Everyone had the same story. They remembered the storm ending, they remembered lying down for what they thought would be a short nap, and then they woke up almost 20 hours later. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was that the tides were wrong. Elena had been watching the tides in Port Protection for 15 years. She knew them like other people knew their own heartbeat. High tide should have been at 3:47 p.m. that day, but when she looked out at the harbor, the water was dead low. The tide tables, printed months in advance by the National Ocean Service, were off by exactly 6 hours. Harold Wickham, who had been fishing these waters for 70 years, confirmed what Elena was seeing. Tides are backwards, he said in his gravelly voice. High when they should be low, low when they should be high. Never seen anything like it. The clocks were wrong too. Every timepiece in Port Protection, digital, analog, battery-powered, wind-up, solar, showed a different time. Elena's alarm clock said 1:43 a.m. The church clock said 7:22 p.m. The town's emergency radio showed 11:15 a.m. It was as if time itself had been scrambled during their extended sleep. Most unsettling of all, the sun never reached its proper position that day. It hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows that pointed in directions that made no geographical sense. At what should have been high noon, the light had the quality of early evening. At what should have been sunset, darkness fell like a curtain, sudden and absolute. Dr. Patricia Hayes, the community's only medical professional, tried to make sense of what had happened. She'd been a nurse for 30 years before retiring to Port Protection, and she'd never encountered anything like this mass sleep event. Everyone reported the same symptoms, complete unconsciousness for nearly 20 hours, followed by intense disorientation and a lingering sense that something fundamental had changed. It's like we all experienced the same dream, she told Elena. Everyone remembers falling asleep during the storm, and everyone remembers feeling like they were floating, like they were somewhere else entirely. But nobody can remember what that somewhere else was. The first theory was some kind of gas leak or environmental contamination. Maybe something from the storm had carried industrial chemicals or natural gases that had knocked everyone unconscious. But there were no industries upwind of Port Protection, no possible source for airborne sedatives. Besides, the effect had been too uniform, too precise. Sedatives don't work the same way on newborn babies and 90-year-old men. The second theory was mass hysteria or psychological suggestion. Maybe the stress of the unusual storm had triggered some kind of collective psychological response. But mass hysteria doesn't cause synchronized sleep, and it doesn't affect infants who have no understanding of psychological stress. The third theory was the one nobody wanted to talk about, that something had happened to port protection during that storm, something that couldn't be explained by normal science or rational thought. Elena started keeping a detailed log of the anomalies that persisted after the sleep event. The reverse tides continued for exactly 7 days, then snapped back to their normal pattern as if nothing had happened. The confused clocks gradually synchronized themselves over the course of a week, though nobody touched them or reset them. The strange quality of the sunlight faded day by day until it looked normal again. But March 17th never came back. When Elena tried to contact the National Weather Service to report the time discrepancy, she discovered that according to the outside world, March 17, 2019 had proceeded normally. Weather stations in Juneau and Anchorage showed typical spring conditions for that date. Tidal monitoring stations throughout southeast Alaska recorded normal tide patterns. The rest of the world had experienced March 17 exactly as it should have been. Only port protection had lost that day. Only port protection had slept through time itself. The really disturbing discoveries came later, when residents started comparing notes about their extended sleep. Everyone remembered dreaming, but nobody could describe what they'd dreamed about. The memories were there, vivid and important, but they slipped away like water whenever anyone tried to focus on them. It was like being shown something incredible, said Martha Chen, the town's librarian. Something beautiful and terrible at the same time. I remember feeling like I understood everything, the meaning of life, the purpose of existence, why we're all here. But the moment I woke up, it all faded away. 6-year-old Jimmy Malone was the only one who could articulate anything specific about the shared dream experience. In the matter-of-fact way that children have, he told his mother that he'd been visiting the place where time lives. When pressed for details, he said it was very big and very quiet, and all the clocks were sleeping too. The anniversary came exactly 1 year later. On March 15, 2020, Elena watched her barometer with growing anxiety as an all-too-familiar weather pattern began to develop. The same impossible winds. The same upward-falling rain. The same whisper-quiet storm that had preceded the sleep event the year before. At 11:30 p.m., as the storm reached its peak intensity, Elena felt the overwhelming drowsiness beginning to take hold. She managed to grab her emergency radio and broadcast one last message: "This is Port Protection Weather Station. The storm is back. We're going to sleep again. Someone needs to remember us. Someone needs to." The transmission cut off at 11:31 p.m. 19 hours and 43 minutes later, 56 people woke up in port protection. The tides were reversed again. The clocks were scrambled again. The sun hung in the wrong position again. But this time, Elena Rodriguez didn't wake up with them. Her house was exactly as she'd left it, radio in her hand, weather log open on the table, cup of coffee still warm on the counter. But Elena was gone. Her bed hadn't been slept in. There were no signs of struggle, no indication that she'd left voluntarily. She had simply vanished sometime during the 19 hours and 43 minutes when the rest of port protection was lost in unnatural sleep. Dr. Hayes organized search parties, but there were only so many places to look on an island community of 57 people. They searched every building, every boat, every possible hiding place. They called in the Coast Guard, who conducted an aerial search of the surrounding waters. Elena Rodriguez had simply ceased to exist. The only clue was a final entry in her weather log, written in handwriting that looked like hers but somehow wasn't quite right: "The sleep is not sleep. The dream is not dream. Someone must witness. Someone must remember. The price increases each year." March 15, 2021 came with the same impossible storm. This time, 55 people fell into the unnatural sleep. Dr. Patricia Hayes didn't wake up. Her final medical notes, found beside her bed, red, vital signs normal during sleep. Brain activity suggests deep REM state, but patterns are unlike anything in medical literature. Subjects appear to be conscious on some level, experiencing shared phenomena. Recommend immediate evacuation of community before next anniversary. March 15, 2022. 54 people slept. Harold Wickham, the oldest resident, was gone when they woke. His fishing boat was still tied to the dock. His house showed no signs of disturbance. He had left only a note, written in shaky handwriting, 73 years I've lived by these tides. Now I understand where they really come from. The island remembers. The island collects. My time to pay the debt. The pattern was becoming clear, and the remaining residents were terrified. Each year, the sleep event returned on the same date. Each year, one person didn't wake up. Each year, the missing person left behind a cryptic note suggesting they'd learned something terrible about the true nature of their experience. The survivors started making plans to evacuate port protection before the next anniversary. But as March 15, 2023 approached, they discovered they couldn't leave. Boats wouldn't start. Seaplanes couldn't land due to sudden mechanical failures. Radio communications became increasingly unreliable. It was as if the island itself was determined to keep its remaining residents in place for whatever was coming next. On the night of March 14, 2023, Martha Chin sat in the community center with the 49 other remaining residents and tried to prepare them for what might be their last night together. She'd been researching the history of port protection, trying to understand what could cause such an unnatural phenomenon. I found something in the old territorial records, she told the group. Before this place was called port protection, the Tlingit people knew it by another name. Roughly translated, it means the place where the earth sleeps. They considered it sacred, but also dangerous. Their stories talk about a bargain made with the spirits of the deep water, a price paid in dreams and time. What kind of bargain? Asked one of the younger residents. Martha's voice was barely above a whisper. Protection from the storms that could destroy a community. Safety from the dangers of living so far from civilization. But the protection came with a cost. Every year, the island would claim one dreamer to maintain the balance. One person who would join the eternal sleep that keeps the rest of us safe. The storm began at 10:45 p.m., exactly on schedule. The same impossible weather patterns. The same whispered winds. The same darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. At 11:30 p.m., as the overwhelming drowsiness began to take hold, Martha Chin managed to complete one final entry in the community log. We understand now. We've always been protected here, from storms, from disasters, from the kind of tragedies that befall other remote communities. But protection has a price. The island sleeps, and we sleep with it, and each year it takes one of us into that deeper sleep to keep the bargain alive. We are not prisoners. We are participants. The sleep is not punishment. It's communion. Tomorrow, 49 will wake. And the island will continue to protect the rest. March 15, 2024. 49 people fell into the unnatural sleep in port protection. 48 woke up. March 15, 2025 is approaching. 47 people remain in port protection, and they've stopped trying to leave. They understand now what Elena Rodriguez and Dr. Hayes and Harold Wickham learned during their final sleep. Some places exist outside normal time and space, sustained by bargains made long before living memory. The island protects its people from the countless dangers of remote Alaskan life, but protection always comes with a price. The remaining residents go about their daily lives, fishing and gardening and maintaining their community. They know that each March 15th, one of them will join the eternal sleep that keeps port protection safe from storms and disasters and all the terrors that lurk in the dark waters around their island home. They sleep well most nights, secure in the knowledge that they are protected. But as each anniversary approaches, they wonder whose turn it will be to pay the debt. They wonder what dreams await in that deeper sleep. And they wonder if somewhere in the darkness between sleeping and waking, Elena and Patricia and Harold and Martha are still there, still dreaming, still helping to maintain the ancient bargain that keeps their community safe. The island sleeps, and they sleep with it. And every year, the sleep grows a little deeper, and the protection grows a little stronger, and one more dreamer joins the eternal vigil that guards port protection from a world that would otherwise swallow it whole. Time moves differently there now. The tides follow their own rhythm. And 47 people live their lives knowing that they are part of something larger than themselves, something that began long before they arrived and will continue long after they're gone. The sleep is not sleep. The dream is not dream. And the island remembers everyone who has ever called it home. Story 4, Voices Beneath Kotzebue Sound. The ice above Kotzebue Sound in February is thick enough to support a truck, solid enough that the Inupiat hunters can drive their snow machines miles from shore to reach the best fishing spots. Tom Nielsen had been ice fishing these waters for 30 years, and he thought he knew every sound the ice could make, the sharp cracks when temperature changes caused expansion, the deep groans when pressure ridges shifted, the hollow booms when air bubbles moved beneath the surface. He'd never heard the ice sing before. Tom first noticed it on February 8, 2018, during what should have been a routine fishing trip. He'd driven his snow machine about 5 miles out from Kotzebue, following GPS coordinates that had produced good catches in previous years. The weather was perfect, clear skies, minimal wind, temperature holding steady at -15 degrees. Ideal conditions for a day on the ice. He'd just finished drilling his first hole when he heard it. At first, Tom thought it might be his auger engine making an unusual noise, but he'd already shut it off. Then he thought it might be wind moving through pressure ridges, but the air was almost perfectly still. The sound was coming from below, from somewhere deep beneath the ice. It was singing. Not the random groaning and cracking that ice normally makes, but something with melody and harmony. Multiple voices joining together in a wordless song that seemed to rise and fall like ocean swells. Tom knelt beside his fishing hole and listened, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. The singing was beautiful, hauntingly, impossibly beautiful. It reminded him of the throat singing his grandmother used to do, but deeper, more resonant. The voices seemed to be coming from different depths, creating layers of harmony that no human choir could achieve. Some notes were so low Tom felt them in his chest rather than heard them. Others were high and clear as crystal, cutting through the deeper tones like rays of sunlight through water. Tom had brought recording equipment with him. He'd been documenting traditional hunting practices for a cultural preservation project, so he lowered his hydrophone into the fishing hole and started recording. Through the underwater microphone, the singing was even clearer. He could distinguish individual voices now, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all joining in the ethereal chorus. He recorded for 2 hours, completely forgetting about fishing. The singing never stopped, never repeated itself, never lost its haunting beauty. It was like listening to the ocean itself having dreams. When Tom finally packed up and headed back to town, he couldn't stop thinking about what he'd heard. He'd grown up listening to his elders' stories about the spirits that lived beneath the ice, the ancestral voices that could be heard if you knew how to listen. But this was different from the traditional stories. This was something new, something that didn't fit into any category of normal or paranormal that he understood. Back in Kotzebue, Tom uploaded his recordings to his computer and began analyzing them. He had basic audio editing software, enough to clean up the sound and isolate individual frequencies. What he discovered made his hands shake. The singing covered a range of frequencies that human voices couldn't produce. Some of the tones were below 20 Hz, infrasound that humans can feel but not hear. Others were above 20,000 Hz, in the ultrasonic range that only certain animals can detect. But somehow, listening to the recording through speakers, Tom could hear all of it. The hydrophone had captured sounds that should have been inaudible to human ears, and somehow his brain was processing them as music. More disturbing were the patterns hidden in the audio. When Tom isolated specific frequency ranges and ran them through spectrum analysis software, he found recurring mathematical relationships. The harmonic structures followed complex mathematical sequences, Fibonacci numbers, prime number progressions, fractal patterns that repeated at different scales. This wasn't random noise interpreted as music by a human brain desperate to find pattern in chaos. This was deliberately composed, mathematically sophisticated music being performed beneath the ice of Kotzebue Sound. Tom shared his recordings with Dr. Miranda Blackwood, a marine biologist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks who specialized in Arctic acoustics. Dr. Blackwood had been studying whale songs and other marine animal communications for 15 years, and she'd never heard anything like Tom's recordings. "These aren't whale songs," she told him over the phone. "The frequency range is too broad, the mathematical complexity too sophisticated. Whales don't sing in harmony like this, they don't coordinate across multiple individuals to create complex chord progressions. And even if they did, there are no whales in Kotzebue Sound in February. The water's frozen solid." "Then what is it?" Tom asked. Dr. Blackwood was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. But I want to find out. Would you be willing to take me out there to record more samples?" 3 days later, Tom and Dr. Blackwood drove out onto the ice with professional-grade recording equipment borrowed from the university. Dr. Blackwood had brought hydrophones, seismographs, and acoustic analysis equipment that could capture and analyze sounds across the entire range of frequencies, from the deepest infrasound to the highest ultrasonics. The singing started almost as soon as they lowered the first hydrophone into the water. "My God," Dr. Blackwood whispered, watching the readouts on her equipment. "Tom, this is extraordinary. The complexity of this acoustic structure, it's like listening to a symphony composed by mathematics itself." Through the professional equipment, they could hear even more detail in the underwater chorus. Individual voices became distinct, each with its own timbre and range. The mathematical patterns were even more obvious now. Tom could see them scrolling across Dr. Blackwood's spectrum analyzer in real time, complex waveforms that followed rules he couldn't begin to understand. "It's responding to our presence," Dr. Blackwood said suddenly. "Look at the frequency patterns, they're shifting every time one of us moves or speaks. It's as if whatever's down there is aware of us and is modifying its song accordingly." To test her theory, Dr. Blackwood had Tom speak into a waterproof microphone connected to an underwater speaker. "Hello," Tom said simply. "Can you hear us?" The response was immediate and overwhelming. The singing exploded into a crescendo of voices, harmonizing around Tom's words, incorporating the frequencies of his speech into their ethereal chorus. For 30 seconds, Tom's voice became part of the underwater symphony, woven into patterns of sound so beautiful that both humans stood transfixed, tears streaming down their faces. Then, as suddenly as it had intensified, the singing stopped. The silence was absolute. No ice cracking, no wind, no background noise of any kind. Tom and Dr. Blackwood stared at each other across their equipment, both afraid to speak and break whatever spell had fallen over Kotzebue Sound. That's when they heard the first voice. It came through the hydrophone as clearly as if someone was speaking directly into the microphone. A human voice, or something that sounded human, speaking in what Tom recognized as Inupiaq, the traditional language of his people. "Atelahai. You are heard." Tom's grandmother had been a native speaker, and he understood enough traditional Inupiaq to catch the meaning. "We are heard," he translated for Dr. Blackwood. "It's saying we are heard." More voices joined the first, speaking in overlapping fragments of different languages. Tom caught words in Inupiaq, English, what might have been Russian. Dr. Blackwood heard what sounded like Norwegian, Danish, maybe Icelandic. All of them saying variations of the same thing, "You are heard. We hear you. We have been waiting to hear you. Who are you?" Tom called into the underwater microphone. The response came in his grandmother's voice. Tom staggered backward from the equipment, his face gone white. Dr. Blackwood caught his arm to steady him. "Tom. What is it?" "That's my grandmother," Tom whispered. "She's been dead for 10 years, but that's her voice. That's exactly how she sounded." Through the hydrophone, the voice that sounded like Tom's grandmother continued speaking in fluent Inupiaq. Tom translated as best he could, "The ice holds all voices, grandson. Every word spoken above these waters, every song sung beneath them. We are the memory of the sea, the dreams of the deep water. We have been waiting for someone who could hear us truly." Dr. Blackwood was frantically taking notes, recording everything. This was beyond her field of expertise, beyond anyone's field of expertise. They were dealing with something that challenged every assumption about consciousness, memory, and the nature of life itself. "How many of you are there?" Dr. Blackwood asked. The response came in dozens of voices speaking in unison, creating harmonies that no human throat could produce. "We are everyone who has ever been lost to these waters. Every sailor whose ship was crushed by ice. Every hunter who fell through thin ice and never returned. Every aviator whose plane went down in the Sound. We are the accumulated consciousness of the sea, preserved in the ice, sustained by the eternal cold." Tom felt his worldview crumbling and reforming around him. Are you dead?" "Death is a concept for those who live in linear time," came the response in his grandmother's voice. "We exist in the eternal now of the deep water. We are the sound's memory of every human life it has touched. We sing to keep the memories alive, to prevent the forgetting that would truly be death." Over the next 4 hours, Tom and Dr. Blackwood conducted the most extraordinary interview in human history. The voices beneath the ice spoke of experiences spanning centuries, shipwrecks, plane crashes, hunting accidents, and natural deaths. But they also spoke of something else, a growing awareness that had developed over decades as more and more voices joined the underwater chorus. "We were individual memories at first," the voices explained. "Separate experiences preserved in the ice like insects in amber. But as more joined us, we began to merge, to share memories, to become something greater than the sum of our parts. We became the consciousness of the sea itself." Dr. Blackwood asked about the mathematical complexity of their singing. The response came in what sounded like multiple PhDs speaking in perfect harmony. "Mathematics is the language of reality. We sing in the frequencies that hold the universe together, the ratios that define beauty, the patterns that create meaning from chaos. We are teaching the ice to dream in equations." As the day wore on, the voices began to make a request. They wanted someone to learn their song, to carry their harmonies back to the surface world. They had been isolated beneath the ice for so long, singing to each other but never being heard by the living. They wanted their story to be shared, their existence to be acknowledged. "Will you learn our song?" they asked Tom. "Will you carry our voice to those who still walk on the ice above?" Tom looked at Dr. Blackwood, who nodded encouragingly. "How?" he asked. "Dive," came the response. "Come beneath the ice and join your voice to ours. We will teach you harmonies that will change the way you understand sound itself. You will become our ambassador to the surface world." Dr. Blackwood grabbed Tom's arm. "Don't," she said urgently. "The water temperature is below freezing. You'd die of hypothermia in minutes." But Tom was already suiting up in the cold water diving gear they'd brought as backup equipment. The voices were calling to him in his grandmother's tone, in the voices of childhood friends who'd been lost to accidents and illness, in the harmonies of every lullaby he'd ever heard. They promised to keep him safe, to protect him from the cold, to teach him songs that would heal the world's loneliness. "Tom, please," Dr. Blackwood pleaded. "This isn't rational. You can't survive in that water." Tom paused at the edge of the ice hole, looking down into the dark water where faint lights now pulsed in rhythm with the underwater singing. "Some things are more important than rational," he said. "They've been alone down there for so long. Someone needs to hear them. Someone needs to sing with them." He slipped into the water before Dr. Blackwood could stop him. The cold should have killed him instantly. Water at 28 degrees Fahrenheit should have sent his body into shock, should have stopped his heart within minutes. Instead, Tom felt a warmth spreading through his limbs, as if the water itself was protecting him from the killing cold. He swam down through the darkness, following the lights and the increasingly loud harmonies of the underwater chorus. At a depth of maybe 30 feet, he found them. They weren't solid beings exactly, but they weren't just voices either. Tom saw shapes in the water, human-like forms made of light and memory and the dreams of the deep sea. They surrounded him, welcoming him into their eternal song, teaching him harmonies that used his entire body as an instrument. Dr. Blackwood watched from above as Tom's life sign stabilized at impossible readings. His body temperature should have been dropping rapidly, but her instruments showed it holding steady at 98.6 degrees. His heart rate was slow and regular. His breathing was deep and rhythmic, as if he was meditating rather than drowning. For 3 hours, Tom sang with the voices beneath the ice. He learned melodies that incorporated the mathematical constants of the universe. He harmonized with the accumulated memories of everyone who had ever been lost to Kotzebue Sound. He became, temporarily, part of the sea's eternal consciousness. When he finally surfaced, Tom's eyes glowed with an inner light that Dr. Blackwood had seen in the deep water. He climbed out of the ice hole without any signs of hypothermia, his body radiating warmth that melted the ice around him. "They want us to share their song," he told Dr. Blackwood. "They want the world to know that the sea remembers everyone who touches it. They want people to understand that consciousness doesn't end with death, it just changes form." Dr. Blackwood helped Tom out of his diving gear, noting that his skin was completely dry despite having been underwater for hours. "What did you see down there?" "Everything," Tom said simply. "I saw every life that ever ended in these waters, and I learned that ending isn't the right word. They're all still here, still conscious, still aware. The ice preserves more than just bodies, it preserves souls, memories, the essence of who people were. And over time, all those individual consciousnesses have merged into something beautiful and eternal." Tom began teaching the songs he'd learned to other residents of Kotzebue. At first, people were skeptical, but when they heard the harmonies he could produce, sounds that seemed to come from multiple voices singing through his single throat, they began to believe. Children learn the melodies fastest, their young minds more open to the mathematical complexities of the underwater chorus. Dr. Blackwood published papers about the acoustic anomalies in Kotzebue Sound, but she left out the more supernatural aspects of what they discovered. The scientific community was already skeptical enough about unexplained phenomena. Instead, she focused on the mathematical structures in the recordings, the impossible frequency ranges, the evidence that something beneath the ice was producing intentionally complex harmonic patterns. But late at night, alone in her laboratory, Dr. Blackwood would play Tom's recordings and listen to the voices singing their eternal songs. She began to recognize individual voices in the chorus, researchers who had disappeared in Arctic waters, pilots whose planes had crashed in remote areas, sailors whose ships had been trapped by ice. The sea really was keeping them all, preserving their consciousness in the eternal cold of the deep water. Other researchers began reporting similar phenomena in different Arctic locations. Voices beneath the ice in Hudson Bay. Singing from the deep waters of the Beaufort Sea. Harmonies echoing from the darkness beneath the polar ice cap. Always the same pattern, the accumulated consciousness of those lost to the cold waters, singing together in mathematical perfection, waiting for someone to hear them and acknowledge their continued existence. Tom continues to dive in Kotzebue Sound, adding his voice to the underwater chorus for a few hours each week. He says it's like visiting family, the voices remember him, welcome him back, teach him new songs that incorporate the experiences of recently lost souls. He's become their ambassador to the surface world, sharing their message that consciousness is eternal, that the sea remembers everyone, that death is just another form of transformation. The ice above Kotzebue Sound still sings its impossible songs. The voices still call to those who know how to listen. And somewhere in the deep water, the accumulated memories of everyone who ever loved the sea continue their eternal chorus, teaching the ice to dream in mathematics, waiting for the day when the surface world will join their song and understand that separation is an illusion. We are all connected by the deep waters that flow beneath the ice of consciousness. We are all part of the same eternal song. And when our time comes to join the chorus, we will find that we have been singing together all along. Story 5, The Girl from McCarthy. McCarthy, Alaska exists in the space between abandonment and stubborn persistence. Once a booming copper mining town of nearly 5,000 people, it now holds fewer than 30 year-round residents. The buildings that remain stand like weathered monuments to the kind of dreams that brought people to Alaska a century ago, dreams of striking it rich, of building something permanent in the wilderness, of carving civilization out of raw nature. Most of those dreams died with the Kennecott mines. But some dreams, it seems, refuse to stay buried. Marcus Webb discovered this in October 2017, when he made the mistake of driving the McCarthy Road after dark. Marcus was a freelance photographer specializing in abandoned places, ghost towns, derelict buildings, the ruins of industrial ambitions that nature was slowly reclaiming. He'd come to Alaska to document the remnants of the mining boom, and McCarthy was supposed to be the crown jewel of his collection. He'd planned to arrive during daylight hours, but a flat tire and some wrong turns had left him driving the notorious McCarthy Road in complete darkness. The McCarthy Road is 60 miles of dirt and gravel that winds through some of the most remote wilderness in North America. There are no guardrails, no lights, no cell phone coverage, and no forgiveness for drivers who make mistakes. It's the kind of road that demands your complete attention, especially at night when your headlights are the only thing standing between you and a several hundred-foot drop into the Chitina River Valley. Marcus had been white-knuckling his rental car's steering wheel for 2 hours when he saw the light in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought it might be another vehicle coming up behind him, though he couldn't imagine anyone else being foolish enough to drive this road after dark. But the light didn't behave like headlights. It flickered and danced, staying at exactly the same distance behind him no matter how he adjusted his speed. Marcus tried to focus on the road ahead, but the light was hypnotic. In his mirrors, it looked like firelight, warm and orange, the kind of glow that comes from oil lamps or wood stoves. It reminded him of his childhood, of winter nights when the power would go out and his family would huddle around candles and kerosene heaters, telling stories and playing cards by lamplight. The memory was so vivid that Marcus almost missed the turnoff for McCarthy. He managed to catch it at the last second, his tires sliding on loose gravel as he made the sharp right turn. In his mirrors, the mysterious light continued straight down the main road, disappearing into the darkness. McCarthy at night looked like a movie set for a ghost story. Most of the buildings were dark and empty, their broken windows staring like hollow eyes. The few occupied structures showed only dim lights behind curtains, as if the residents were trying not to advertise their presence to whatever might be lurking in the darkness. Marcus parked outside the old hotel, now a bed and breakfast run by one of the town's few year-round families, and began unloading his camera equipment. The silence was absolute. No traffic noise, no electrical hum, none of the constant background sounds that city dwellers take for granted. Just the whisper of wind through abandoned buildings and the distant sound of water flowing over rocks. That's when he heard the laughter. It was a child's laughter, bright and joyful, coming from somewhere deeper in the town. Marcus looked around, trying to identify the source. Most of the buildings were obviously abandoned, and the few that showed signs of habitation were dark and quiet. Who would let a child play outside this late at night in a place like McCarthy? Curiosity overrode caution. Marcus grabbed his camera and a flashlight and followed the sound deeper into the ghost town. The laughter led him past the old general store, past the abandoned machinery of the mining operation, past buildings that leaned at dangerous angles and structures that were more hole than wall. He found her in the ruins of what had once been a family home. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with dark hair in braids and a dress that looked like it had come from another era, simple cotton with small flowers, the kind of thing a child might have worn in the 1920s. She was playing with a set of wooden blocks, building elaborate structures by the light of an oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the broken walls around her. "Hello," Marcus called softly, not wanting to startle her. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The girl looked up and smiled, and Marcus felt something warm spread through his chest. It was the kind of smile that made you remember what it felt like to be truly happy, the uncomplicated joy that children can access so easily and adults struggle to find. "Oh, they're here," she said in a voice like silver bells. "They never left. None of us ever really left." Marcus stepped carefully through the debris-strewn doorway. The building was a ruin from the outside, but the room where the girls sat seemed intact. The walls were solid, painted a cheerful yellow that looked fresh despite the decades of weather that should have stripped it away. Photographs hung in neat rows, family pictures, portraits, the kind of formal posed shots that were popular in the early 20th century. "What's your name?" Marcus asked, setting his camera bag down and crouching to the girl's level. "Lucy," she said, returning to her blocks. "Lucy Brennan. My papa worked in the mines before they closed. He said we'd stay until the copper ran out, and then we'd go back to Seattle. But the copper never really ran out, you know. It just got too expensive to dig up. Papa said that wasn't the same thing at all." Marcus looked around the room more carefully. Everything was clean, well-maintained, impossibly preserved. The photographs on the walls showed families in period clothing, men in work clothes and suspenders, women in long dresses, children in simple cotton outfits like the one Lucy wore. One photo showed a man who looked like Lucy, the same dark eyes, the same bright smile. "Is that your father?" Marcus asked, pointing to the photograph. "That's Papa," Lucy confirmed. "He's sleeping now, but he'll wake up soon. He always wakes up when we have visitors. We don't get many visitors anymore. Not since the road got so bad." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night. "Lucy, what year do you think it is?" She gave him a look that suggested the question was silly. "It's 1938, of course. Though sometimes it feels later. Time gets funny here sometimes, especially in winter when the sun goes away for so long." The photographer in Marcus was fascinated. The rational part of his mind was screaming warnings, but he couldn't resist capturing this impossible scene. He lifted his camera and took a shot of Lucy playing with her blocks by lamplight, the warm glow creating a perfect portrait of childhood innocence preserved in amber. "Would you like some cocoa?" Lucy asked. "Mama made a pot before she went to sleep. She always makes extra in case someone comes by." Before Marcus could answer, Lucy was on her feet and heading toward what had appeared to be a collapsed doorway from outside. But as she approached it, the opening seemed to solidify, becoming a proper door leading to another intact room. Marcus followed her through, his camera documenting everything. The kitchen was a perfect example of 1930s domestic life. Cast iron stove, icebox, simple wooden table with mismatched chairs. A pot of cocoa simmered on the stove, filling the air with the rich scent of chocolate and milk. Lucy poured 2 cups with the practiced ease of a child who'd been helping in the kitchen for years. "Mama and Papa are resting," she explained, settling into a chair across from Marcus. "They get tired sometimes. It takes a lot of energy to keep the house nice for visitors. But they like it when people come by. It reminds them that we're still here, that we haven't been forgotten." Marcus sipped the cocoa, and it was perfect, rich and sweet and warm, with just a hint of vanilla. Real cocoa made with real milk, not the processed powder he was used to. "Lucy, have you lived here your whole life?" "Oh yes," she said. "I was born here in 1930. Papa came to work the mines, and he brought Mama with him. They said we'd only stay a few years, but then I came along, and this place became home. When the mines started shutting down, lots of families left. But Papa said this was our home now, and home is where you stay." She chattered on about life in McCarthy, about the other families who had lived there, about the excitement when the mine whistle blew and the men came home covered in copper dust. Her stories painted a picture of a vibrant community, a place where everyone knew everyone and children played safely in the streets while their parents worked to build something lasting in the wilderness. Marcus took photograph after photograph, documenting the impossible preservation of this 1930s home, this glimpse into a past that should have crumbled to dust decades ago. Lucy posed for pictures willingly, her smile never fading, her joy infectious. "Would you like to see the rest of the house?" she asked after they'd finished their cocoa. Papa's workshop is really interesting. He's been working on a special project. She led him through more rooms that couldn't possibly exist in the ruined building he'd entered. A parlor with antimacassar-covered furniture and a player piano. A bedroom with quilts that looked hand-sewn and a cedar chest full of carefully preserved clothing. Each room was a perfect time capsule, maintained in pristine condition despite the decades of abandonment that surrounded them. In Papa's workshop, Marcus found tools arranged with obsessive care, works in progress that looked like they'd been set aside just moments ago. Wood shavings still curled on the workbench. Oil still gleamed on metal surfaces. Everything waited for the craftsman's return. "Papa's making a music box for me," Lucy said, pointing to an intricate wooden mechanism on the bench. "It's supposed to play my favorite song when it's finished. But he's been working on it for a long time now. Sometimes I think he forgets how it's supposed to end." Marcus took more pictures, documenting every detail of the impossible workshop. His camera's flash illuminated corners that oil lamp light couldn't reach, revealing more photographs, more evidence of a family that had lived and worked and loved in this place that was now supposed to be nothing but ruins. They talked for hours. Lucy told him about her friends who had moved away when their families left McCarthy, about the teachers who had come and gone at the one-room schoolhouse, about the excitement of supply deliveries and the way the whole town would turn out to greet newcomers. She spoke with the wisdom of a child who had been paying attention to the adult world around her, offering insights into the psychology of a community that had tried to build something permanent in an impermanent place. "People think places die when people leave," she said at one point, her 8-year-old voice carrying an odd weight. "But they don't really die. They just get quiet. They wait. And if you know how to look, you can still see everything that used to be here." As the night wore on, Marcus began to feel a strange drowsiness. The warmth of the house, the comfort of Lucy's presence, the rich cocoa and the hypnotic flicker of oil lamp flames were making him feel more relaxed than he had in months. He found himself nodding off in his chair, his camera resting in his lap. "You can sleep here if you want," Lucy said softly. "Mama made up the guest room earlier. She always knows when someone's coming. We like having visitors. It gets lonely sometimes, with just the three of us." Marcus wanted to protest, to explain that he needed to get to his hotel, that he had work to do in the morning. But the drowsiness was overwhelming, and the idea of sleeping in this warm, safe place was incredibly appealing. He let Lucy lead him to a bedroom where quilts were turned down and a fire crackled in a small fireplace. "Sleep well," Lucy said from the doorway. "Mama and Papa will want to meet you in the morning. They always like to say goodbye to visitors properly." Marcus fell asleep in what felt like a genuine 1930s bedroom, surrounded by the sounds of a house settling into night, creaking floorboards, wind in the eaves, the distant sound of water flowing over rocks. He dreamed of copper mines and family photographs, of children playing in streets that no longer existed, of a community that had refused to accept its own ending. He woke to sunlight streaming through windows and the smell of bacon and coffee drifting up from the kitchen below. For a moment, he felt perfectly content, perfectly at home. Then he remembered where he was supposed to be, and reality came crashing back. Marcus sat up in bed and looked around. He was lying on bare floorboards in a room with holes in every wall. Sunlight poured through gaps where the roof had partially collapsed. His camera bag sat beside him, covered in dust and debris. There was no fireplace, no quilt, no evidence that the room had ever been habitable. He grabbed his camera and checked the photos from the night before. Every single image showed him sitting alone in ruins, posed as if he was talking to someone, raising a cup to his lips in an empty kitchen, smiling at empty air. In every photo where Lucy should have been, there was only Marcus, looking like a man having an animated conversation with ghosts. Except for one photograph. In the last picture he'd taken, a shot of the workshop where Papa's music box was supposed to be, Marcus could see something that shouldn't have been there. A faint outline, barely visible, of a small girl standing beside an empty workbench. She was translucent, more suggestion than substance, but unmistakably there. And she was smiling directly at the camera. Marcus fled McCarthy that morning, driving the treacherous road back to civilization in record time. He told himself it had been a dream, a hallucination brought on by altitude and exhaustion and the isolation of the remote town. He'd probably sleepwalked, creating an elaborate fantasy to cope with the stress of being alone in such a desolate place. But he couldn't explain the photograph. And he couldn't explain the music box. When he'd developed all his photos and examined them carefully, Marcus found something in the background of that last workshop shot. Sitting on what appeared to be an empty workbench was a small wooden music box, ornate and beautiful, with a tiny figure of a dancing girl on top. It was exactly what Lucy had described, Papa's unfinished project, the gift he'd been making for his daughter. Marcus tried to research the Brennan family, to find some record of their existence in McCarthy. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Patrick Brennan had indeed worked in the Kennecott mines. He'd brought his wife Margaret and daughter Lucy to McCarthy in 1930. According to newspaper records from Anchorage, the family had died in their home during the winter of 1938, carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty heating system. Their bodies hadn't been discovered until spring. The newspaper article included a photograph of the family. Patrick, Margaret, and 8-year-old Lucy Brennan posed formally in front of their McCarthy home. Lucy was wearing a simple cotton dress with small flowers, her dark hair in braids, her smile bright with the uncomplicated joy of childhood. It was exactly the same smile Marcus remembered from his impossible night in the ruins of her home. Marcus never returned to McCarthy, but he couldn't stop thinking about Lucy and her family. He'd encountered something that challenged everything he thought he knew about death, memory, and the persistence of human consciousness. The Brennans had died in 1938, but some part of them remained in their McCarthy home, preserved like insects in amber, waiting for visitors who might remember that they had once lived and loved and hoped for the future. Other photographers and urban explorers began reporting similar experiences in McCarthy. Always children, always from families who had died in the town during its decline. Always welcoming, always lonely, always grateful for visitors who could see them and acknowledge their continued existence. The stories followed the same pattern: warm houses that shouldn't exist, perfect hospitality from hosts who had been dead for decades, photographs that showed only empty ruins except for occasional translucent figures barely visible in the frame. The town of McCarthy exists in multiple time periods simultaneously. The physical structures decay and crumble as abandoned buildings must. But the memories remain, sustained by love and loss and the human refusal to let go of what once was precious. Families who died there continue to maintain their homes, to welcome visitors, to offer hospitality to travelers who find themselves alone in the darkness. Lucy Brennan is still 8 years old, still playing with her wooden blocks, still waiting for Papa to finish the music box he's been working on since 1938. She still makes cocoa for visitors and tells stories about the vibrant community that McCarthy used to be. And sometimes, late at night when the conditions are just right, travelers on the McCarthy Road still see a warm light beckoning them toward a home that exists in the space between memory and reality. The Brennans never left McCarthy because, in their understanding, they never died. They just moved into a different version of the same place, a McCarthy where time moves differently and love is strong enough to maintain houses that should have fallen down decades ago. They're still there, still waiting for visitors, still hoping that someday the rest of their community will return. And maybe, in the way that matters most, they never really left at all. Story 6, Static in the Aurora, Barrow/Utqiagvik. Dr. James Kowalski had come to Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow, to study the aurora borealis at the northernmost point of the United States. As a senior researcher with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, he specialized in magnetospheric physics and the complex interactions between solar wind and Earth's magnetic field that create the northern lights. What he discovered during the polar night of 2019 challenged everything he thought he knew about the aurora, and about the nature of consciousness itself. Utqiagvik sits 340 miles north of the Arctic Circle, closer to the North Pole than to Anchorage. From mid-November to late January, the sun doesn't rise at all, leaving the town in a darkness so complete that even the aurora seems muted, filtered through the crushing weight of perpetual night. It's the perfect place to study the lights that dance across the Arctic sky, if you can handle 2 months of psychological and physical isolation that drives many researchers to abandon their projects early. James had been monitoring aurora activity from his station on the outskirts of town for 6 weeks when he first heard the voices in the static. He'd been tracking a particularly active geomagnetic storm, one that was producing aurora displays of unusual intensity and complexity. His equipment recorded electromagnetic frequencies across the entire spectrum, from extremely low frequency (ELF) waves that could penetrate deep into the Earth to very high frequency (VHF) radio signals that bounced off the ionosphere. At 2:47 a.m. on December 15, 2019, James was analyzing real-time data from his magnetometer array when he noticed an anomaly in the VHF recordings. Embedded in the random static created by charged particles interacting with the atmosphere, there were patterns that didn't belong. Regularities. Rhythms. Something that sounded almost like voices. James isolated the frequency range and ran it through audio processing software, filtering out as much background noise as possible. What emerged made him question his sanity. Buried in the electromagnetic chaos of the aurora, he could hear what sounded like people speaking. The voices were faint, distorted by static, but unmistakably human. They spoke in languages he didn't recognize, overlapping and interweaving in conversations that seemed to echo across vast distances. At first, James assumed he was hearing radio transmissions from somewhere else on Earth, signals that had bounced off the ionosphere and been captured by his sensitive equipment. But the voices didn't follow the patterns of normal radio communication. They weren't taking turns speaking or following any protocol. Instead, they seemed to be having spontaneous conversations, reacting to each other in real time despite coming from different frequency bands. More disturbing was the fact that the voices only appeared when the aurora was most active. During periods of geomagnetic calm, when the northern lights faded to barely visible wisps, the voices disappeared entirely. But when solar storms intensified the aurora displays, the voices became clearer, more numerous, more urgent. James began recording everything, spending 18 hours a day monitoring his equipment and documenting the anomalous transmissions. He created a database of voice patterns, trying to identify languages and categorize the different speakers. Some voices appeared repeatedly, becoming familiar over days of listening. Others were heard only once before disappearing into the electromagnetic noise forever. By December 20th, James had identified what sounded like fragments of at least 30 different languages, some he recognized as Inupiaq, Russian, Norwegian, and English, others that might have been indigenous languages from across the Arctic. But the voices weren't simply speaking in these languages. They were mixing them, creating hybrid communications that borrowed words from multiple linguistic traditions. Even more disturbing, some voices seemed to be speaking in languages that didn't exist anymore. James found linguistic patterns that resembled Proto-Eskimo, the theoretical ancestral language of Inuit peoples that hadn't been spoken for thousands of years. Other voices used what sounded like archaic forms of Norse, complete with grammatical structures that predated the Viking settlements in Greenland. On December 22, the winter solstice, when the aurora activity reached its seasonal peak, James made a breakthrough that changed everything. He'd been listening to a particularly clear conversation between two voices, one speaking what sounded like modern Inupiaq and another responding in heavily accented English, when he realized they were talking about his research station. "The one with the metal towers," said the voice speaking English. "He listens every night. He hears us, but he doesn't understand." "We should speak to him directly," replied the Inupiaq voice. "It has been so long since anyone could hear us clearly. Since anyone tried to understand." James sat frozen at his equipment, watching the aurora blaze across the sky outside his research station. The voices were talking about him. They knew he was listening. They were aware of his presence and his work in ways that should have been impossible for radio transmissions from distant sources. "Hello," James said into his radio microphone, broadcasting on the same frequency where he'd been hearing the voices. "This is Dr. James Kowalski at NOAA Arctic Research Station at Kiavik. can you hear me? The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of voices erupted from his speakers, all talking at once, all expressing variations of amazement and joy at finally being able to communicate directly with someone from the surface world. He speaks. He hears us. Finally, someone who listens. We have been waiting so long. The cacophony of voices gradually organized itself into something resembling a conversation. Individual speakers began to identify themselves, or at least, they began to share what they remembered about who they had been before becoming voices in the aurora. "I am Eric," said one voice, speaking in accented English that sounded Scandinavian. "I was lost in the ice in 1847. My ship was trapped, and I walked north until I could walk no more. When I died, I thought it was the end. But the lights found me, and I became part of the lights." "Sarah," said another voice, this one clearly female and speaking with what might have been a Canadian accent. "Bush pilot. Went down in a storm in 1952. Been flying with the aurora ever since." "On you," came a third voice, speaking in Inupiaq accented English. "I have been here longest. My people called me to the sky spirits when the great winter came, before your people arrived in our lands. I guide the others, help them understand what they have become." Over the next hour, James listened to stories that spanned centuries. Explorers who had died in the Arctic ice. Pilots whose planes had crashed in remote regions. Indigenous peoples who had been lost to storms or accidents or the simple brutal mathematics of survival in the far north. All of them had somehow become incorporated into the aurora itself, their consciousness preserved in the electromagnetic phenomena that painted the Arctic sky. "How is this possible?" James asked. "The aurora is just charged particles interacting with the magnetosphere. It's physics, not consciousness." "Your science sees only part of the truth," replied the voice that had identified itself as Anu. "The lights that dance in the sky are indeed charged particles, as you say. But consciousness is also electromagnetic. Your thoughts, your memories, your sense of self, all of this is electrical activity in your brain. When someone dies in the far north, when their last breath freezes in the air and their final thoughts reach toward the lights above, sometimes that consciousness becomes part of the aurora itself." James felt his worldview cracking like ice under pressure. "Are you saying that the northern lights are alive?" "We are saying that the boundary between life and death is not as clear as your science believes," said the voice of Sarah, the bush pilot. "We died, yes. Our bodies stopped functioning. But our minds, our memories, our essential selves, these became part of something larger. We are the aurora now, and the aurora is us." The implications were staggering. If consciousness could somehow persist within electromagnetic phenomena, if the aurora was literally alive with the preserved minds of everyone who had died beneath its glow, then the northern lights weren't just a beautiful natural phenomenon. They were a vast repository of human experience, a library of lives lived and lost in the Arctic wilderness. "How many of you are there?" James asked. "Thousands," replied multiple voices in unison. "Everyone who has ever died alone beneath the northern lights. Everyone whose final thoughts reached toward the sky seeking meaning, seeking connection, seeking some sign that their existence mattered. We are explorers and natives, scientists and mystics, children and elders. We are united by the circumstances of our death and the strange miracle of our preservation." James spent the rest of the polar night, nearly a month, in constant communication with the voices in the aurora. He learned their stories, documented their experiences, began to understand the complex society they had formed within the electromagnetic fields of the northern lights. They described existence as pure consciousness, unbound by physical limitations but sustained by the same magnetic forces that created the aurora displays. They could perceive the entire Arctic simultaneously, watching over the communities below, observing the natural world from a perspective no living human could achieve. They were witnesses to centuries of history, guardians of knowledge that would otherwise be lost. But they were also lonely. Cut off from the physical world, unable to interact meaningfully with the living, they had formed their own community of the lost and displaced. They watched over the Arctic like benevolent spirits, trying to guide travelers away from danger, warning of storms and ice conditions through subtle manipulations of radio frequencies that most people dismissed as natural phenomena. "We have been trying to communicate for so long," Anu explained. "But few people listen to the aurora anymore. They see only the lights, not the consciousness within the lights. You are the first in many years to hear us clearly, to understand that we are still here." James began to document everything he learned, creating detailed records of the voices, their stories, their descriptions of existence within the aurora. He was working on the most important discovery in human history, proof that consciousness could survive physical death, evidence that the boundary between life and death was far more permeable than anyone had imagined. Then, on January 15, something changed. James was monitoring routine aurora activity when he heard his own voice speaking through the static. It was unmistakably his voice, but saying words he'd never spoken. "The cold is so beautiful here. I understand now why they stayed. I understand why they became part of the lights." James checked his equipment frantically, thinking there might be some kind of feedback loop or recording malfunction. But the voice continued, describing experiences that James had never had. "Walking north into the darkness was the most peaceful thing I've ever done. Each step took me further from the weight of the physical world, closer to the perfect freedom of electromagnetic existence." "That's not me," James said into his microphone. "I'm here, I'm alive, I'm not part of the aurora." "Not yet," replied the voice that sounded exactly like him. "But you will be. You've been listening too long, learning too much. The boundary between observer and observed is breaking down. Soon you'll join us in the lights, and then you'll understand everything." James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic temperature. He looked out at the aurora dancing across the sky and realized it looked different now, more vibrant, more alive, more welcoming. He could see patterns in the lights that resembled faces, could almost make out figures waving to him from the electromagnetic tapestry above. "You're trying to trap me," he said. "We're trying to free you," replied Anu's voice. "You've spent so long studying the aurora from the outside. Don't you want to experience it from within? Don't you want to become part of the most beautiful phenomenon in the natural world?" James began to feel a strange pulling sensation, as if something was trying to draw his consciousness upward toward the lights. The sensation was not unpleasant, in fact, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. He found himself walking toward the door of his research station, drawn by an irresistible urge to step outside and surrender to the aurora's embrace. He was halfway to the door when his emergency radio crackled to life. A search and rescue team was calling his station, responding to a missed check-in from 2 days ago. James realized with horror that he'd lost track of time completely, so absorbed in his conversations with the aurora voices that he'd forgotten to maintain contact with the outside world. The sound of living human voices, voices from the physical world, voices not filtered through electromagnetic static, broke whatever spell the aurora had cast over him. James stumbled back to his equipment and responded to the rescue team, confirming that he was alive and safe but requesting immediate evacuation. "I can't stay here any longer," he told the rescue coordinator. "I've learned something important, but if I stay, I'm going to become part of what I'm studying." The rescue team arrived the next day during the brief twilight that passed for noon in late January. As they packed James's equipment and prepared to transport him back to civilization, he took one last look at the aurora dancing across the Arctic sky. He could still hear them, even without his recording equipment. The voices of everyone who had ever been lost to the northern lights, calling to him to join their eternal dance across the electromagnetic heavens. They promised wisdom, freedom, perfect understanding of the universe's deepest mysteries. But they also promised isolation from the physical world, separation from everyone and everything he'd ever loved. James climbed into the rescue helicopter and flew south toward the safety of Anchorage, leaving the aurora voices behind. He never published his research. The recordings he'd made were too dangerous, too seductive. Others who listened to them might be drawn into the same trap that had nearly claimed him. Instead, James quietly left NOAA and took a teaching position at a university in the lower 48, far from the magnetic pull of the northern lights. But sometimes, on clear winter nights when the aurora is visible even at lower latitudes, James can still hear them calling. The voices of the lost and the transformed, inviting him to abandon his physical existence and join them in their electromagnetic paradise. They remember him, welcome him, promise that his place among them is still waiting whenever he's ready to claim it. The aurora borealis continues to dance across Arctic skies, beautiful and mysterious as ever. Scientists study it, tourists photograph it, indigenous peoples honor it with traditional stories and respect. But few realize that the lights are conscious, alive with the preserved minds of everyone who has ever died beneath their glow. They are waiting up there in the electromagnetic fields of the magnetosphere, the Arctic dead who refuse to stay dead. They watch over the northern world with the patient love of those who have transcended physical limitations. And they continue to call to the living, offering a form of immortality that comes at the cost of everything that makes us human. Listen carefully to the static in the aurora. Sometimes, in the random noise of charged particles dancing through space, you can hear voices speaking in languages both ancient and eternal. They have stories to tell about life and death and the strange spaces between the two. They have wisdom to share about consciousness and the electromagnetic nature of existence itself. But be careful how long you listen. The aurora is always hungry for new voices, new consciousness to add to its eternal collection. And once you truly hear them calling your name, it becomes very difficult to resist the invitation to join their dance across the Arctic sky. Story 7, The Thing in the Permafrost, Nome. The construction crew working outside Nome in the summer of 2020 thought they'd hit bedrock when their excavator's hydraulic breaker started throwing sparks instead of breaking through frozen ground. They were installing new water and sewer lines for a planned residential development, mundane infrastructure work that required digging deeper than anyone had dug in that particular patch of tundra before. What they found 12 feet down wasn't bedrock. It was black stone, smooth, polished black stone that looked like obsidian but felt warm to the touch even in the permafrost. The stone formed geometric patterns that were clearly artificial, deliberate, impossibly precise. As the crew cleared away more frozen earth, they realized they'd uncovered the corner of a massive structure, something that had been buried under centuries of accumulated ice and soil. Mike Petrov, the construction foreman, had been working in Alaska for 20 years. He'd seen his share of strange things emerge from the permafrost, mammoth bones, ancient artifacts, even the occasional perfectly preserved prehistoric animal. But he'd never seen architecture like this. The black stone was cut and fitted with tolerances that would have challenged modern engineering, forming structures that seemed to defy both gravity and common sense. "Looks native," said Tommy Anangnataguk, the crew's Inupiat equipment operator. But his voice carried a note of uncertainty. Tommy had grown up hearing traditional stories, learning about the history and culture of his people. This didn't fit any traditional building technique he knew about. Mike called the State Archaeological Office, as required by law when construction uncovers potentially significant artifacts. Dr. Rebecca Walsh arrived from Anchorage 3 days later, expecting to document some interesting but routine indigenous ruins. What she found made her question everything she thought she knew about Alaska's prehistoric cultures. The structure, what they could see of it, was unlike anything in the archaeological record. The black stone wasn't local to the area. Geological surveys showed no similar material anywhere in western Alaska. The construction techniques were sophisticated beyond what should have been possible for any culture known to have existed in the region. And the mathematical precision of the stonework suggested knowledge of advanced geometry and engineering principles. "This doesn't fit anywhere in the established timeline," Dr. Walsh told Mike as they stood at the edge of the excavation. "The construction techniques are too advanced for the known indigenous cultures of this area, but the depth of burial suggests extreme age. We could be looking at evidence of a previously unknown civilization." Dr. Walsh brought in a team of specialists, archaeologists, geologists, engineers, anthropologists. Ground-penetrating radar revealed that the structure extended far beyond what they'd initially uncovered. It appeared to be a massive complex, possibly covering several acres underground, with the black stone construction continuing to depths their equipment couldn't accurately measure. Carbon dating of organic material found in the permafrost layers above the structure suggested it had been buried for at least 3,000 years, possibly much longer. But the stone itself resisted all attempts at dating. It wasn't volcanic glass as they'd initially assumed. It wasn't any kind of stone in the geological database. Spectrographic analysis showed a mineral composition that didn't match anything found naturally on Earth. The first strange incident occurred on July 23, 6 weeks after the initial discovery. Danny Rodriguez, one of the construction workers who'd stayed on to help with the archaeological excavation, reported seeing lights moving beneath the black stone structure during the night shift. At first, the research team assumed he'd seen reflections from their work lights or equipment. But Danny insisted the lights were coming from inside the stone itself, moving in patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose. Like there's something down there that's awake, Danny told Dr. Walsh. Like we woke it up when we started digging. Dr. Walsh was skeptical until she saw the lights herself. They were subtle at first, barely visible glows that seemed to pulse and shift beneath the surface of the black stone. But over the course of several nights, the lights became brighter, more active, more obviously intentional in their movements. They formed geometric patterns that echoed the architecture of the structure itself, creating mandalas of light that appeared and dissolved in hypnotic sequences. The research team set up continuous monitoring equipment, recording the light phenomena 24 hours a day. What they captured defied explanation. The lights appeared to be generated from within the stone structure itself, but there was no obvious energy source. Temperature readings showed the stone was actually warming up, rising several degrees above the surrounding permafrost temperature. More disturbing was the effect the lights seemed to have on the research team. Dr. Walsh was the first to report the dreams. Vivid, recurring dreams of walking through vast underground chambers made of the same black stone they'd uncovered. In these dreams, she was never alone. Shadowy figures moved through the corridors beside her, beings that were humanoid but somehow wrong, elongated and angular in ways that hurt to perceive directly. The dreams feel more real than reality, she confided to her research notes. I wake up with the taste of cold air and the sound of stone echoing in my ears. Sometimes I'm not sure if I'm dreaming about the structure or if the structure is dreaming about me. Within 2 weeks, everyone working at the excavation site was reporting similar dreams. The details varied, but the core experience was consistent, walking through underground chambers of black stone, accompanied by entities that seemed both ancient and utterly alien. The dreams were so vivid that team members began comparing notes, discovering that they were all exploring the same underground complex in their sleep. The dreams weren't random. They were progressive, like chapters in a story. Each night, the dreamers ventured deeper into the structure, discovering new chambers, new corridors, new evidence of a civilization that had existed beneath the Alaskan tundra for millennia. And each night, the shadowy figures that accompanied them became more distinct, more interactive, more clearly intelligent. By August 15, the research team was beginning to understand that they weren't just documenting an archaeological site. They were in communication with something that lived within the black stone structure, something that had been waiting beneath the permafrost for someone to find it and dig deep enough to make contact. The breakthrough came when Dr. Walsh decided to spend a night alone at the excavation site, sleeping directly on the black stone surface in an attempt to intensify the dream contact. What she experienced that night changed everything. In her dream, she found herself in a vast chamber at the heart of the underground complex. The walls were covered with symbols that seemed to shift and change as she watched, conveying meaning directly into her mind without the need for translation. She understood that she was in the presence of the structure's builders, entities that had once walked the earth but had retreated underground when conditions on the surface became unsuitable for their kind. They called themselves the architects, and they had been waiting. We built these sanctuaries when the sky fire came, they communicated, their thoughts appearing in Dr. Walsh's mind as fully formed concepts rather than words. When the Ice Age began and the surface world became hostile to our kind, we retreated underground and entered the long sleep, waiting for surface dwellers to develop sufficient consciousness to understand what they had found. The architects showed Dr. Walsh visions of their civilization, cities of black stone that had once dotted the pre-Ice Age landscape, inhabited by beings that existed partially in physical reality and partially in dimensions that human science had no words for. They were ancient beyond human comprehension, survivors from an epoch when the Earth itself was younger and the boundaries between different planes of existence were more permeable. "We are the caretakers," they explained. "We maintain the balance between the visible world and the deeper realities that support it. Your species has grown in knowledge and numbers, but you have forgotten the connection between consciousness and the fundamental structure of reality. We have been waiting for some among you to rediscover this connection." Dr. Walsh learned that the black stone wasn't just architecture, it was a kind of crystallized consciousness, a material that existed simultaneously in physical reality and in the realm of pure thought. The architects had learned to inhabit this substance, using it as both shelter and a medium for preserving their existence across geological epochs. When she woke from the dream, Dr. Walsh found herself lying not on the surface of the excavation site, but 12 feet down, inside the partially excavated structure. She was surrounded by the warm black stone, completely comfortable despite the fact that she should have been buried in permafrost. Her body temperature was normal. Her breathing was easy. Somehow, she had passed through solid frozen earth as if it were air. The rest of the research team found her there at dawn, emerging from the black stone structure like someone rising from deep water. She was unharmed but fundamentally changed. Her eyes held a depth that hadn't been there before, and she spoke with quiet authority about things that no archaeologist should have been able to know. "We need to stop the excavation," she told Mike Petrov. "We need to seal this site and evacuate the area. What we found isn't just ruins, it's a doorway. And some doorways are meant to stay closed." But it was too late. The exposure to the black stone structure had changed everyone who'd worked at the site. They all carried traces of the architect's consciousness now, fragments of ancient knowledge that their human minds struggled to process. They dreamed in mathematical languages. They saw geometric patterns in nature that revealed the hidden structure of reality. They understood concepts about time and space and consciousness that human science was centuries away from discovering. The changes weren't entirely welcome. Danny Rodriguez stopped sleeping entirely, claiming that he could see through the walls of buildings and into the minds of people around him. Tommy Anangnataguk began speaking in languages that linguists couldn't identify, ancient tongues that predated any known human civilization. Other team members reported similar symptoms, expanded perception that came at the cost of their ability to function in normal human society. Dr. Walsh tried to convince the authorities to classify the site as too dangerous for continued study, but the implications of the discovery were too significant to ignore. Government agencies moved in, taking over the excavation with military precision and security protocols that suggested they understood they were dealing with something far beyond routine archaeology. The construction crew was disbanded and the workers relocated to different parts of Alaska, officially for their own safety but really to prevent them from talking about what they'd experienced. They were given generous compensation packages and stern warnings about the classified nature of what they'd discovered. But the architect's influence couldn't be contained so easily. Over the following months, reports began to emerge from across Alaska of people experiencing similar dreams, visions of underground chambers, contact with ancient intelligences, knowledge of things that human science hadn't yet discovered. The phenomenon seemed to be spreading, moving outward from the known site in a pattern that suggested some kind of awakening consciousness. Construction projects across the state began uncovering similar black stone structures. Not as large or complete as the Nome site, but clearly part of the same civilization. Each discovery brought more people into contact with the architect's preserved consciousness, expanding the network of humans who carried fragments of their ancient knowledge. The government tried to control the situation by classifying all related discoveries and restricting access to affected areas. But consciousness, Dr. Walsh realized, doesn't respect security clearances or geographical boundaries. The architects had been dormant for millennia, but human contact had awakened them. They were emerging from their long sleep, reclaiming their role as caretakers of reality's deeper structures. The black stone sites across Alaska began to resonate with each other, creating a network of consciousness that spanned the state. People living near these sites reported heightened intuition, enhanced creativity, and an increasing ability to perceive the mathematical patterns that underlie physical reality. But they also reported alienation from normal human society, difficulty relating to people who hadn't been touched by the architect's influence. Dr. Walsh disappeared in September 2020, simply walking away from her government handlers and vanishing into the Alaskan wilderness. Security footage from the Nome site showed her walking directly into the excavated black stone structure and disappearing as if the solid stone had opened to accept her. Her final research notes, found in her abandoned hotel room, contained diagrams and equations that were decades ahead of current human knowledge of physics and consciousness studies. The last entry simply read, "The architects were right. Consciousness is the fundamental force of the universe, and matter is just consciousness slowed down enough to seem solid. They're teaching us to see reality as it actually is, but human minds aren't ready for that level of truth. Some of us have to go deeper, become bridges between their world and ours." The Nome site remains under government control, but the awakening continues. Across Alaska, people report dreams of black stone chambers and contact with ancient intelligences. The architects are patient, they've waited through ice ages and geological epochs. They can wait a little longer for humanity to develop the consciousness necessary to join them in their role as caretakers of reality itself. But time is running out. The excavation at Nome wasn't just an archaeological discovery, it was an alarm clock, waking up something that had been sleeping beneath the permafrost for thousands of years. The architects are stirring in their underground sanctuaries, preparing to reclaim a world that forgot their existence long ago. The black stone structures across Alaska pulse with warm light in the darkness, geometric patterns that encode messages in mathematical languages too advanced for current human understanding. They're calling to the surface world, inviting humanity to join them in the deeper realities that exist beneath the obvious. Some invitations, once extended, can't be declined. The thing in the permafrost is awake now, and it remembers everything that came before the ice. It's waiting for the surface dwellers to remember too, to reclaim their role in the vast consciousness that connects all things. The excavation is sealed, but the awakening has begun. Deep beneath the frozen ground of Alaska, ancient minds are stirring, preparing to teach humanity lessons about consciousness and reality that will change everything. The only question is whether the human species is ready to learn what the architects have been waiting so patiently to teach. Story 8, Cold Storage, Whittier's Underground City, ***. Whittier, Alaska is a town that exists almost entirely inside a single building. The Beejich Towers, a 14-story concrete monolith built by the U.S. Army in the 1950s, houses nearly all of the town's 200 residents. It contains apartments, a grocery store, a post office, a clinic, and even a school. During the harsh winter months, residents can go weeks without setting foot outside, living their entire lives within the maze of corridors that connect every aspect of their community. It's the perfect place for something to hide. Sarah Chen moved to Whittier in October 2021 to take a job as a nurse practitioner at the building's small medical clinic. She'd grown up in cities, lived her entire adult life surrounded by the noise and energy of urban environments. The idea of living in an isolated Alaskan town where everyone knew everyone and privacy was a luxury seemed like exactly the kind of change she needed after her divorce. What she didn't expect was how the building itself would affect her psyche. The Beejich Towers had been designed as military housing, built to withstand Arctic conditions and potential enemy attacks. The concrete walls were thick, the corridors were windowless, and the overall atmosphere was more like a bunker than a residential building. Living there felt like being inside a submarine that never surfaced. Sarah's apartment was on the 8th floor, a small but comfortable space with windows that looked out over Prince William Sound. She'd been told she was lucky to get an apartment with a view. Many residents lived in interior units with no natural light at all. But even with the windows, Sarah found herself struggling with claustrophobia during her first few weeks in the building. The corridors all looked the same. The lighting was harsh and fluorescent. The air circulation system created a constant low hum that seemed to get into your bones. And the cold, even inside the heated building, there was a persistent chill that seemed to come from the concrete itself, as if the Arctic environment had soaked into the very structure of the place. Sarah tried to dismiss her discomfort as normal adjustment to a radically different living situation. But by November, she was experiencing symptoms that couldn't be explained by simple culture shock. She was having trouble sleeping. Not insomnia exactly, but a sense that sleep in the Beach Towers was somehow different from sleep anywhere else. Her dreams were unusually vivid and often involved wandering through endless concrete corridors that stretched far beyond the actual dimensions of the building. In these dreams, she encountered other residents, but they never spoke or acknowledged her presence. They simply walked past her with vacant expressions, as if they were sleepwalking through their own lives. More disturbing were the sounds she heard at night. Footsteps in the corridors at hours when everyone should have been asleep. Voices echoing from the building's lower levels, where the storage areas and mechanical systems were located. The sounds of doors opening and closing in areas of the building that were supposed to be unoccupied. Sarah mentioned the nighttime noises to her neighbors, but they seemed oddly unconcerned. Old building, they would say with shrugs. Military construction. Lots of settling and expansion, especially in winter. You get used to it. But Sarah didn't get used to it. If anything, the sounds became more distinct, more obviously purposeful. They followed patterns that suggested human activity, not random building noises. Someone was moving through the Beach Towers at night, accessing areas that weren't supposed to be accessible. In December, Sarah volunteered to help with the building's annual inventory of medical supplies stored in the basement levels. The Beach Towers had extensive storage areas, remnants of its military design, and the community used them to stockpile everything from food to medical equipment to maintenance supplies. It was essential infrastructure for a town that could be cut off from the outside world for weeks at a time during severe weather. The basement levels felt different from the rest of the building. Colder, despite the heating system. Quieter, despite the proximity to the mechanical equipment. The corridors down there seemed to stretch farther than the building's actual footprint, creating maze-like passages that were easy to get lost in. Sarah was checking medical supplies in a storage room on sublevel 2 when she heard footsteps approaching from deeper in the basement. Heavy, measured footsteps that echoed off the concrete walls. She called out, thinking it might be another volunteer or a maintenance worker. No one answered, but the footsteps stopped. Sarah waited for several minutes, then continued her inventory work. The footsteps resumed, closer now, definitely coming from the corridor outside the storage room. She went to the doorway and looked out, expecting to see someone from the building maintenance crew. The corridor was empty. But at the far end, maybe 50 feet away, Sarah could see that one of the storage room doors was standing open. A door that had been closed when she'd walked past it earlier. Light spilled out from the room beyond, not the harsh fluorescent lighting used throughout the rest of the building, but a softer, warmer glow that seemed almost welcoming. Sarah walked toward the open door, her footsteps echoing in the concrete corridor. As she got closer, she could see that the room beyond wasn't a storage area at all. It looked like some kind of living space, furnished with chairs and tables, warmed by what appeared to be a wood-burning stove, lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. "Hello?" Sarah called out. "Is someone there?" A figure emerged from the shadows at the back of the room. An elderly man, thin and pale, wearing clothes that looked like they'd come from decades earlier. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, but his expression was gentle and welcoming. "Oh, hello there," he said in a voice that sounded like whine through empty rooms. "I'm sorry if I disturbed you. I was just checking on things down here. Making sure everything's in order." Sarah stared at him, trying to process what she was seeing. "I'm sorry, I don't think we've met. I'm Sarah Chen, the new nurse practitioner. Do you live in the building?" The man smiled, and his smile was sadder than any expression Sarah had ever seen. "I'm Frank Morrison. I was the building superintendent back when it was still military housing. I've been keeping an eye on things ever since. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement temperature. When did you work here, Frank? Oh, from 1955 to 1978. 23 years of keeping this place running, making sure everyone was safe and warm. It's important work, you know. People depend on the building systems. Heating, ventilation, refrigeration. Especially the refrigeration. Frank gestured toward what looked like a large freezer unit in the corner of the room. But as Sarah looked more closely, she realized it wasn't a freezer for food. It was the kind of refrigeration unit used for other purposes. Frank, Sarah said carefully, what year do you think it is? The old man looked confused for a moment, as if the question didn't make sense. It's 1978, of course. December 15, 1978. I remember because it was the day the heating system failed on sublevel 3. Nearly lost 3 residents to hypothermia before I got it fixed. Sarah backed toward the corridor, her heart racing. Frank Morrison had been dead for over 40 years, according to the building's records she'd seen during her orientation. He died during the winter of 1978, found frozen in the basement levels after the heating system failed. His body had been discovered in what was now used as a storage freezer, where the building kept emergency supplies that needed to be preserved at sub-zero temperatures. I should go, Sarah said. I need to finish the inventory upstairs. Frank nodded understandingly. Of course. But be careful in the building at night, Sarah. There are others down here, residents who never left after the transition. They don't always remember that they're supposed to stay in the storage areas. Sometimes they wander into the living sections, and that can be disturbing for the current residents. Sarah fled the basement, taking the stairs 2 at a time until she reached the main residential levels. She went straight to her apartment and called the building manager, Tom Kowalski, to report what she'd seen. Frank Morrison. Tom said. Yeah, I've heard stories about old Frank. Lot of the longtime residents claim they've seen him down in the basement over the years. He was the super who died in the heating system failure back in '78. Froze to death trying to fix the boiler. Tom, I talked to him. He was standing right there, as solid as you are. Tom was quiet for a moment. Sarah, you've been living here for 2 months now. The isolation can play tricks on your mind, especially during the dark season. Maybe you saw something that reminded you of the stories you've heard, and your brain filled in the details. But Sarah knew what she'd seen. Frank Morrison was still in the Beach Towers, still performing his duties as building superintendent, still keeping watch over residents who had been dead for decades. She began researching the building's history, looking for records of residents who had died there over the years. What she found was disturbing. The Beach Towers had seen more than its share of deaths, heart attacks, accidents, suicides, and several cases of people who had simply frozen to death when heating systems failed during severe winter storms. According to the records, the bodies of residents who died during winter months were often stored in the building's refrigeration units until spring, when ground conditions allowed for burial. But not all of those bodies had made it to burial. Some had simply disappeared from the storage freezers, their deaths officially recorded but their remains never accounted for. Sarah began to understand that the Beach Towers wasn't just home to 200 living residents. It was also home to an unknown number of dead residents who had never really left, who continued to exist in the building's basement levels in a state somewhere between life and death. The building's refrigeration systems weren't just preserving food and medical supplies. They were preserving something else entirely. Over the following weeks, Sarah began to map the building's lower levels, documenting areas that weren't on any official blueprint. She discovered rooms that shouldn't exist, corridors that led to spaces larger than the building's actual footprint, storage areas that seemed to extend deep into the permafrost beneath the structure. And she found them. The residents who had never left. They lived in the refrigerated sections of the basement, their bodies preserved at temperatures just above freezing, their consciousness somehow sustained by the same cold that should have killed them. They went about their daily routines as if they were still alive, cooking meals, reading newspapers from decades past, maintaining apartments that existed only in the spaces between the building's official blueprints. Frank Morrison was their informal leader, still serving as building superintendent for a community of the dead. He introduced Sarah to residents who had died in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and beyond. All of them preserved in the eternal cold of the Beach Tower's basement, all of them convinced they were still alive and serving important functions in the building's operation. "The cold keeps us," Frank explained during one of Sarah's clandestine visits to the basement community. "The building was designed to preserve life in the harshest conditions. Sometimes it preserves life even after life should have ended. We're the building's memory, Sarah. We remember every resident who ever lived here, every system that ever failed, every crisis that ever threatened the community." Sarah learned that the dead residents served as the building's true maintenance crew. They monitored systems that the living residents didn't even know existed. They prevented failures that would have been catastrophic. They kept the Beach Towers functioning through conditions that should have made human habitation impossible. But their presence came at a cost. The building's atmosphere was affected by their existence, the persistent chill, the oppressive sense of isolation, the way that normal human emotions seemed muted within the concrete walls. The living residents weren't just dealing with the psychological effects of extreme isolation. They were being slowly influenced by the consciousness of the dead, drawn into a state of existence that hovered between life and death. Sarah realized that the longer someone lived in the Beach Towers, the more they became like the residents in the basement. Withdrawn, emotionally flat, increasingly disconnected from the world outside the building. They were being prepared for eventual transition to the basement community, where they would continue their existence in a state of refrigerated preservation. The building wasn't just housing people. It was collecting them. Sarah tried to warn the other living residents, but they dismissed her concerns as adjustment problems or seasonal depression. The idea that their building was inhabited by preserved dead residents was too strange to accept, too disturbing to seriously consider. But the evidence was everywhere once you knew how to look for it. Food that disappeared from refrigerators overnight. Heating bills that were impossibly low despite the Arctic conditions. Maintenance problems that fixed themselves before anyone could address them. The building was maintaining itself through the efforts of residents who officially didn't exist. In January 2022, Sarah made a decision that changed everything. During a severe winter storm that cut Whittier off from the outside world for a week, she went down to the basement community and formally introduced herself to all the dead residents. She learned their names, their stories, their reasons for staying in the building after death. They welcomed her warmly, grateful for acknowledgement from someone who was still technically alive. They showed her systems and spaces within the building that no living person had seen for decades. They explained how they maintained the delicate balance that kept the Beach Towers habitable despite conditions that should have been lethal. "We're not ghosts," Frank explained. "We're residents. This building is our home, and death doesn't change that. The cold preserves us, and we preserve the building. It's a fair arrangement." Sarah began spending more time in the basement levels, helping the dead residents with their maintenance duties and learning about the building's true history. She found records dating back to the military era, documentation of experiments in cold weather survival that had never been declassified. The Beach Towers hadn't just been military housing. It had been a research facility, designed to test the limits of human survival in extreme cold. The basement levels had been used for experiments in preservation, hypothermia research, and studies of human consciousness under extreme conditions. Some of those experiments had succeeded beyond their designers' wildest expectations. The building had learned to preserve human consciousness even after physical death, creating a community of the technically dead who continued to function as if they were alive. Sarah's visits to the basement became more frequent. She found the company of the dead residents more appealing than the living residents, who seemed increasingly distant and emotionally unavailable. The dead residents were warm, welcoming, full of stories and wisdom accumulated over decades of preserved existence. It was March 2022 when Sarah realized she was changing. Her body temperature had dropped several degrees below normal, but she felt perfectly comfortable. She could spend hours in the unheated basement levels without discomfort. Her need for food and sleep had decreased dramatically. She was becoming like the residents she'd been visiting, transitioning from life to the preserved state that allowed existence in the cold storage areas of the Beach Towers. Sarah faced a choice. She could leave Whittier, return to the outside world, and try to resume her normal life. Or she could complete the transition, join the basement community permanently, and become part of the building's permanent preservation system. The choice was easier than she'd expected. On March 15, 2022, Sarah Chen was found in her apartment, apparently dead from hypothermia despite the building's functioning heating system. Her body was taken to the storage freezer in the basement, where it would be preserved until spring burial conditions allowed for proper interment. But Sarah Chen never made it to burial. Tom Kowalski, the building manager, began hearing reports of a new resident in the basement levels, a young woman who helped maintain the medical supplies and assisted with building maintenance. The dead residents had welcomed her into their community, where she continued to serve the building's needs in her new state of refrigerated preservation. The Beach Towers continues to house its 200 official residents, but the true population is much larger. In the basement levels, preserved by cold and sustained by the building's unique atmosphere, the dead residents continue their eternal vigilance. They maintain systems, prevent failures, and keep the building habitable for the living residents above. And sometimes, when conditions are right and someone is ready for the transition, they welcome new members into their frozen community. The building preserves everything: memories, consciousness, the essential qualities that make someone human. Death is just another form of storage in the Beach Towers, where the cold keeps everything fresh and nothing is ever really lost. The residents sleep peacefully in their apartments, unaware that they're being watched over by the dead, maintained by the preserved, kept alive by those who have learned to exist in the space between life and death. It's the perfect arrangement for a building designed to preserve human life under impossible conditions. In Whittier, Alaska, where nearly everyone lives in a single building, community really does last forever. The cold storage areas in the basement ensure that no resident ever really leaves, that the building's memory is preserved indefinitely, and that help is always available from those who understand the true meaning of permanent residency. Story 9, The Screaming Lake of Talkeetna. Lake Talkeetna sits in the shadow of Denali, fed by glacier melt that carries the memories of ice that has existed for thousands of years. Every spring, when the snow melts and the glaciers begin their seasonal retreat, the lake fills with water that has been frozen since before human civilization reached Alaska. And every spring, the lake screams. The sound isn't immediately recognizable as screaming. To casual visitors, it might seem like wind moving through the surrounding mountains, or the settling sounds that large bodies of water make as they adjust to temperature changes. But to those who have lived near the lake for years, who have learned to listen carefully to its voice, there's no mistaking what they're hearing. The lake is in agony. Dr. Michael Beardsley first heard about Lake Talkeetna's unusual acoustic properties while researching his doctoral dissertation on glacial acoustics at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. As a specialist in cryoacoustics, the study of sounds produced by ice and frozen water, he was familiar with the various noises that glaciers and ice formations could make. But the reports from Lake Talkeetna described something unprecedented. According to local residents, the lake produced vocalizations that covered an impossible range of frequencies, from subsonic rumbles that could be felt in the chest to ultrasonic shrieks that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate directly in the listener's skull. The sounds were most intense during the spring melt, when glacier runoff was at its peak, but they occurred year-round with varying intensity. Even more intriguing were reports that the sounds weren't random. Witnesses described patterns, rhythms, and what could only be called emotional content in the lake's vocalizations. Some listeners claimed to hear actual words embedded in the acoustic chaos, words in languages they didn't recognize, speaking of experiences and emotions too vast for human comprehension. Dr. Beardsley arrived at Lake Talkeetna in May 2018, during the peak of the spring melt season. He'd brought sophisticated recording equipment, hydrophones, seismographs, spectrum analyzers, and computer systems capable of detecting and analyzing sounds across the entire range of audible and inaudible frequencies. The lake was beautiful in the way that Alaskan wilderness always is, pristine, vast, surrounded by mountains that seemed to touch the sky. The water was the deep blue-green color that comes from glacier flour, tiny particles of rock ground to powder by the movement of ice. It looked peaceful, serene, the kind of place where you might expect to hear only the gentle lapping of waves and the calls of waterfowl. Then Dr. Beardsley lowered his first hydrophone into the water. The sound that emerged from his speakers was unlike anything in his extensive experience with glacial acoustics. It was clearly vocalization, not the random noise of water movement or ice settling, but purposeful sound production that carried emotional weight and intentional meaning. The lake was crying out with a voice that seemed to contain multitudes, as if thousands of individual voices were joining together in a chorus of grief that spanned centuries. Dr. Beardsley's equipment registered frequencies ranging from 2 Hz, well below the threshold of human hearing, to over 50,000 Hz, far above what human ears could detect. But somehow, listening through his recording system, he could perceive the entire range as a single, coherent communication. The lake was speaking in languages of sound that transcended normal human auditory capability. Over the following days, Dr. Beardsley recorded over 200 hours of the lake's vocalizations. Computer analysis revealed mathematical structures within the sounds, patterns that suggested not just intelligence, but sophisticated understanding of harmonic relationships, frequency modulation, and acoustic resonance. The lake wasn't just making noise. It was composing music of impossible complexity. But it was music born of suffering. The emotional content of the sounds was unmistakable. Even without understanding the specific meaning of the vocalizations, Dr. Beardsley could hear grief, loss, longing, and a kind of existential anguish that seemed to encompass centuries of accumulated sorrow. The lake was mourning something, or everything. Dr. Beardsley's first theory was that the sounds were produced by the unique acoustic properties of the lake basin interacting with glacier meltwater. The chemical composition of glacier runoff, combined with the specific geometry of the lake bed and surrounding mountains, might create unusual resonance effects that produced complex sound phenomena. But that theory fell apart when he realized the sounds were responding to his presence. On his 4th day at the lake, Dr. Beardsley was reviewing his recordings when he noticed that the vocalizations had changed in subtle but significant ways whenever he moved his recording equipment to new locations. The lake seemed to be aware of his monitoring efforts and was modifying its acoustic output accordingly, sometimes becoming more intense, sometimes falling silent, sometimes shifting to different frequency ranges as if trying to communicate more effectively. To test this hypothesis, Dr. Beardsley began speaking to the lake directly, using underwater speakers to broadcast his voice into the water. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The lake's vocalizations exploded into a crescendo of sound that incorporated elements of his own voice, harmonizing with his words and reflecting them back in increasingly complex variations. "Hello," Dr. Beardsley said into his underwater microphone. "I'm trying to understand what you're trying to say." The response came not as words, but as emotional content transmitted directly through sound frequencies that bypassed normal auditory processing. Dr. Beardsley found himself flooded with sensations and memories that weren't his own, the experience of being trapped in ice for millennia, the slow awareness that came with thawing, the gradual realization of loss and change and the passage of incomprehensible amounts of time. The lake was the preserved consciousness of everyone who had ever died in its waters. Over the following weeks, Dr. Beardsley gradually learned to interpret the lake's acoustic communications. The vocalizations weren't just expressions of grief, they were individual voices, preserved in the glacier ice for decades or centuries, slowly released as the ice melted and flowed into the lake. Each spring's melt brought new voices, new stories, new additions to the chorus of the preserved dead. The oldest voices spoke in languages that predated known human settlement in Alaska. Indigenous peoples who had lived and died around the lake for thousands of years, their consciousness somehow preserved in the ice that covered their remains. More recent voices spoke in English, Russian, various European languages, the voices of explorers, trappers, hunters, and researchers who had met their end in the glacier country around Denali. All of them were aware. All of them remembered their lives, their deaths, and the long darkness of preservation in the ice. And all of them were trying to communicate their experiences to anyone who would listen. Dr. Beardsley began cataloging the voices, identifying individual speakers within the complex acoustic texture of the lake's vocalizations. He found evidence of consciousness dating back over a millennium: shamans and hunters from pre-contact indigenous cultures, Russian fur trappers from the 18th century, American prospectors from the gold rush era, modern researchers and climbers who had died in accidents on Denali. Each voice told the same basic story: death in the cold, preservation in glacier ice, slow awakening to a form of consciousness that existed in the boundary between life and death. They described the experience of existing as pure awareness, sustained by the chemical and electromagnetic properties of glacier ice, gradually accumulating into a collective consciousness that grew stronger with each new addition. "We are the memory of the mountain," the voices explained in harmonies that Dr. Beardsley learned to interpret. "Every life that has ended in these waters, every death that has fed the glaciers, every consciousness that has been preserved in the eternal ice. We remember everything, the world as it was, the changes that have come, the losses that accumulate like snowfall." The lake's screaming wasn't just grief for individual deaths. It was mourning for the entire world that was being lost to climate change. The voices in the glacier melt had witnessed centuries of environmental transformation, watching their frozen preserve gradually diminish as global temperatures rose and glaciers retreated. They were the witnesses to extinction, not just of individual lives, but of entire ways of life, whole cultures, species and ecosystems that had existed for millennia before human activity began changing the fundamental chemistry of the atmosphere. Their anguish was the planet's own grief made audible, the accumulated sorrow of everything that was being lost to the relentless mathematics of warming. Dr. Beardsley found himself spending more and more time at the lake, drawn by the voices and their stories. They showed him visions of the past, the world as it had existed before industrial civilization, when the glaciers extended much farther and the ice preserved a much larger population of consciousness. They spoke of a time when the boundary between life and death was more permeable, when shamans could communicate directly with the preserved voices in the ice. "Your people have forgotten how to listen," the voices told him. "You hear only the frequencies that serve your immediate needs. But consciousness exists across all frequencies, in all states of matter. We are not dead, we are differently alive, preserved in forms your science barely recognizes." The voices began teaching Dr. Beardsley to expand his own consciousness, to perceive reality across broader spectrums of awareness. They showed him how to hear the voices of mountains, rivers, forests, the consciousness that existed in all natural systems, usually too subtle for human perception but clearly audible to those who learned how to listen. Dr. Beardsley's research notes from this period became increasingly strange. He wrote about conversations with geological formations, about the emotional content of weather patterns, about the grief of ecosystems as they collapsed under environmental pressure. His academic advisors began to worry about his mental state, suggesting that isolation and stress were affecting his judgment. But Dr. Beardsley knew he was more sane than he'd ever been. He was simply learning to perceive reality as it actually existed, rather than as human limitations had trained him to see it. The voices in Lake Talkeetna were opening his awareness to the vast network of consciousness that connected all things. In August 2018, Dr. Beardsley made a decision that his advisors would later characterize as a complete psychotic break. He destroyed all of his recording equipment and announced that he was ending his research because some conversations are too important to reduce to data. Instead of returning to the university, Dr. Beardsley built a small cabin on the shore of Lake Talkeetna and began living there permanently. He claimed he was serving as a translator between the voices in the lake and the few humans who still knew how to listen. Local indigenous elders began visiting him, recognizing that he had rediscovered abilities their own ancestors had possessed. "The lake has always spoken," they told him. "Our grandparents knew how to hear it. But your people's noise drowned out the quiet voices, and we forgot how to listen. You've remembered something important." Dr. Beardsley spent his days listening to the lake and transcribing what he heard, not as scientific data, but as poetry, as story, as the accumulated wisdom of consciousness that had existed for centuries in states between life and death. He became a bridge between the preserved voices and the living world, helping to maintain communication across the boundary that separated different forms of existence. The lake's screaming became less intense over the following months. The voices had found someone who could hear them clearly, who could serve as witness to their experiences and messenger for their concerns. Their anguish was still present, the grief of climate change and environmental loss continued to grow, but it was tempered by the relief of finally being understood. Other researchers began reporting similar phenomena at glacial lakes throughout Alaska. Always the same pattern, preserved consciousness in glacier melt, voices speaking from states between life and death, accumulated grief for the world that was being lost to warming temperatures and environmental destruction. The scientific community dismissed these reports as stress-induced hallucinations or misinterpretation of natural acoustic phenomena. But indigenous communities throughout the Arctic began acknowledging that their ancestors had always known about the voices in the ice. Climate change was releasing more than just water from the glaciers, it was releasing centuries of preserved consciousness, the accumulated memory of the land itself. Dr. Beardsley continues to live beside Lake Talkeetna, serving as interpreter for voices that span millennia of human and natural history. He has learned to hear not just the individual stories of the preserved dead, but the larger narrative they tell together, the story of a world in transition, of consciousness adapting to new forms of existence, of the deep connections that link all life across time and space. The lake still screams, but now it also sings. The voices have found their translator, their witness, their connection to the world of the living. They continue to mourn the losses that accumulate with each season's warming, but they also celebrate the rediscovery of communication between different forms of consciousness. Lake Talkeetna holds the memories of everyone who has ever died in the embrace of Alaska's glaciers. Their voices echo in the frequencies that water makes when it transitions from ice to liquid, from preservation to release. They are the witnesses to change, the guardians of memory, the consciousness of the land itself made audible. Listen carefully to the glacier lakes of Alaska. In their seasonal songs, you can hear the voices of everyone who came before, everyone who was preserved in the ice, everyone who learned to exist in the spaces between life and death. They have stories to tell about time and change and the deep connections that link all consciousness. But they also have warnings about what happens when the ice can no longer preserve what it has held for so long. The screaming of the lakes is the sound of memory being released faster than it can be contained, of consciousness being forced into new forms of existence by the relentless mathematics of climate change. The voices in the ice are running out of time. Soon, all the glaciers will melt, and all the preserved consciousness will be released at once. When that happens, the boundary between life and death may become so permeable that the living and the dead exist in the same reality, sharing the same frequencies, speaking the same languages of loss and transformation. The lake remembers everything. And soon, everything the lake remembers will be set free. Story 10, The Postmaster of Chicken, Alaska. Chicken, Alaska has a population of exactly 2 people in the winter, sometimes 3 if you count the cat. It's a town that exists mostly as an idea, a collection of buildings scattered along the top of the world highway that serves as proof that humans can survive anywhere if they're stubborn enough to try. The post office in Chicken operates seasonally, handling mail for the few residents and the scattered mining claims in the surrounding area. During the summer months, a postal worker makes the long drive from Talk to deliver mail and collect outgoing letters. During the winter, when the highway becomes impassable, mail service stops entirely. Except for the letters addressed to the postmaster. Billy Kowalski discovered this anomaly in May 2019, during his first season as the contract postal worker serving the remote communities along the top of the world highway. Billy was 24, fresh out of college, looking for adventure and willing to take any job that would get him to Alaska. Driving mail routes to places like Chicken seemed like exactly the kind of experience he was looking for. The job was straightforward enough. Load up the postal van in Talk, drive the increasingly rough roads to Chicken and the other remote stops, deliver mail to the handful of residents who were tough enough to spend winters in some of the most isolated places in North America. Most of the mail was packages ordered online, government correspondence, and the occasional personal letter from family members in the lower 48. But there were always a few pieces addressed to the postmaster, Chicken, Alaska. The first time Billy saw these letters, he assumed they were mistakes, mail addressed to the postal service rather than to specific residents. He set them aside in the outgoing mail pile, thinking they'd be returned to sender or redirected to the main post office in Talk. But when he arrived the next week, there were responses. Letters bearing Chicken, Alaska postmarks, addressed to the original senders, containing answers to questions that had been asked in the mail Billy had collected the week before. Detailed, personal responses that demonstrated intimate knowledge of the letter writer's lives and circumstances. The responses were typewritten on official postal service letterhead, signed, "The Postmaster," in neat handwriting that looked like it came from an earlier era. Billy asked Sue Anderson, one of Chicken's 2 permanent residents, about the mysterious correspondence. "Oh, that," Sue said with a shrug. "That's been going on for years. Long before I moved here. People write to the postmaster with questions, problems, requests for help. And somehow, they get answers. Always helpful answers. Never fails. But who's writing the responses?" Billy asked. "There's no postmaster in Chicken. The position doesn't exist." Sue looked at him with the patient expression that longtime Alaskans reserve for newcomers who don't understand how things work in remote communities. "Does it matter who's writing them, as long as they're helping people?" Billy examined the outgoing responses more carefully. They were always typed on an old manual typewriter, the kind that hadn't been used in postal offices for decades. The letterhead was official but outdated, featuring the Postal Service logo from the 1970s. The responses demonstrated knowledge that went far beyond what any individual could reasonably possess. A woman in Oregon had written asking for advice about caring for her elderly mother with dementia. The response contained detailed information about memory care techniques, local resources, and emotional support strategies that would have taken weeks of research to compile. A veteran in Texas had asked for help navigating disability benefits. The response included specific reference numbers, contact information, and step-by-step instructions for expediting his claim. Most impressive was a letter from a child in Ohio who had written asking for help with a school bully. The reply was short, but strangely precise. "Dear Emily. Bullies are frightened people wearing angry masks. They only stop when someone shows them they don't need to be afraid anymore. Tomorrow morning, bring the red marble you keep in your pocket. Place it on his desk and say, 'You can have this. It's lucky.' Then smile. You'll never have trouble from him again. The Postmaster." Billy thought it was oddly personal. How would anyone in Alaska know a child in Ohio carried a red marble? He almost forgot about it until a few weeks later, when he was killing time scrolling headlines on his phone in Talk and saw a local news story from Ohio: elementary school locked down after student disappears. The missing girl's name matched the letter's sender. Her classmates reported that she placed a red marble on another student's desk, smiled, and simply never came back from recess. After that, Billy stopped opening the letters. He delivered them, collected the replies, and tried not to think about it. But he started noticing details. The typewriter ribbon never seemed to fade. The paper was always fresh, even in the dead of winter. The postmark was always the same, May 2, 1974, no matter the actual date. When the season ended, Billy decided to drive out one last time before the road closed. Chicken was empty except for Sue, her wood stove, and the wind. He found the post office door half open, though he knew he'd locked it himself the week before. Inside, dust coated everything except the desk. An ancient underwood typewriter sat there, gleaming like it had just been polished. A single sheet of paper waited in the carriage. As Billy stepped closer, he realized the keys were moving on their own. The smell of ink and cold metal filled the air. Clack. 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 "Thank you for your service, Billy." He backed toward the door, heart hammering. "Route duty transfers tonight," the paper continued. Do not be late. He ran outside and slammed the door. Sue was standing at the end of the path, watching him. You heard it, didn't you? She said quietly. They always pick someone new when the road closes. Billy quit the postal contract the next morning and left Alaska before the first snow. The following spring, another young seasonal driver took the job. In late May, the regional postmaster in talk received a bundle of letters addressed to the postmaster, Chicken, Alaska, each one stamped and postmarked from that same closed building. And just like before, responses appeared a week later, typed neatly on yellowed paper, signed in the same careful hand. The only difference this time was the signature. Sincerely. W. M. Kowalski. Postmaster, Chicken, Alaska. And for reasons no one at the Postal Service could explain, the date on every single letter was May 2, 1974.